The frontier town of Ashford Crossing wasn't the kind of place that forgave mistakes. It was April 1882, and the settlement clung to existence like a half-dead animal refusing to accept its fate. Buildings leaned at angles that suggested they'd been put up drunk and never bothered to straighten out. The main street, if you could call it that, was more dust than road, churned into a fine powder by wagon wheels and horse hooves until it hung in the air like a permanent fog of failure. Elena Voss sat in the back corner of what passed for her workshop, a converted storage room behind the boarding house that smelled of mildew and decades of other people's disappointments. The afternoon light came through a window so dirty it barely qualified as transparent, casting everything in a sickly yellow that made even healthy things look diseased. She held the coin between her thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly. A single silver dollar. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The rent was $2, due tomorrow. She had one. The arithmetic wasn't complicated, but she worked it over and over anyway, as if the numbers might suddenly decide to cooperate. They didn't. Mathematics had never been sentimental. Her stomach cramped, not the sharp pain of hunger, but the deeper ache that came when the body started realizing it might not get fed. 3 days since her last proper meal. 7 since the Hendersons had decided they didn't need their daughter's wedding dress altered after all. "Changed our minds," Mrs. Henderson had said, not meeting Elena's eyes. "Going with something simpler." Translation: they'd heard the rumors. That Elena was struggling, that she might not finish the work, that she was, in the frontier's most damning assessment, unreliable. In a place like Ashford Crossing, reputation was currency. Once it went bad, you might as well pack up and leave. Except Elena had nowhere to go. She'd come here 2 years ago after her father's ranch in Colorado had been seized for debts. She'd watched everything she'd known get auctioned off piece by piece, including her mother's silver tea service and the quilts her grandmother had made. She'd arrived in Ashford Crossing with a decent sewing kit, a trunk of fabric samples, and the kind of optimism that now seemed like evidence of mental deficiency. The town had seemed hungry for skilled work back then. Women needed dresses. Men needed shirts that didn't fall apart after 2 washings. There'd been enough business to rent this space, to buy supplies, to eat regularly. Then the railroad survey team had come through, decided Ashford Crossing wasn't worth the investment, and moved on. The town had been dying ever since, slowly at first, then faster. People left. Those who stayed got meaner, more protective of what little they had. Competition for the remaining work turned vicious. Elena had lost customers to Martha Davenport, who'd started spreading stories. Careless stories. Stories about how Elena's stitching wasn't what it used to be. How she'd been seen looking poorly. How maybe she was drinking, or worse. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. Perception did. Now here she was, 1 coin short of homelessness, hungry enough that she'd started eyeing the paste pot on her workbench and wondering if it was technically food. She could beg. The thought came and went like a bad smell. There were people in town who'd give her something, probably. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house might let the rent slide for a few days. Reverend Morrison would certainly help if she showed up at his door looking pitiful enough. Even the saloon owner, Dutch Kaufman, might toss her some coins if she swallowed enough pride. But that was the problem with pride. It wasn't rational. It didn't care about survival. It just sat there in your chest like an angry cat and hissed at anything that looked like surrender. Elena had watched what happened to people who started begging in Ashford Crossing. They became invisible. Oh, folks would help them once, twice, maybe 3 times. But after that, they'd walk right past you on the street, eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, acting like you weren't even there. You became part of the scenery. Another piece of human debris the town had to step around. She set the coin down on the table and stared at it. The smart thing would be to leave. Pack up, take the coin, and whatever else she could carry, and try somewhere else. Except she'd need at least $5 to get anywhere worth going, and even then she'd arrive as the woman who'd failed in Ashford Crossing. That reputation would travel with her like a disease. A knock on the door made her jump. "It's open," she said, then immediately regretted it. Probably Mrs. Chen coming for the rent early. But the man who pushed through the door wasn't Mrs. Chen. He was tall, taller than the doorframe was entirely comfortable with, and had to duck slightly to enter. He wore a rancher's clothes, canvas pants stained with work, a shirt that had been blue once and was now closer to gray, boots that had seen hard miles. His hat was in his hands, which was either politeness or calculation. Elena couldn't tell which. She recognized him vaguely. Caleb something. He had a ranch north of town, ran cattle, kept to himself mostly. She'd seen him in town maybe half a dozen times in 2 years, always alone, always with that same expression of someone doing an unpleasant but necessary chore. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice had gravel in it. "Mr.—" She left it hanging. "Rourke. Caleb Rourke. Mr. Rourke." Elena stood up, smoothing her skirt automatically. It was wrinkled and showing wear at the seams, but it was clean. She'd made sure of that much. "What can I do for you?" He looked around the workshop, at the cutting table covered in scraps, at the dress form in the corner wearing a half-finished bodice, at the shelves holding thread and buttons and all the small equipment of her trade. His eyes lingered on the empty spaces where there should have been bolts of fabric. "Heard you do quality work," he said. The lie was so transparent Elena almost laughed. Nobody was saying that about her anymore, but she kept her face neutral. "I do my best. I need some things made, shirts mostly, maybe some other items. Ranch work is hell on clothes." Elena's mind raced. This could be legitimate. It could also be charity wearing a very thin disguise. The worst part was she couldn't afford to care which it was. "I'd be happy to discuss it," she said carefully, "though I should mention I'd need payment up front for materials." Something flickered in his expression. Approval, maybe? "Fair enough. How much?" She did quick calculations. Fabric for 3 shirts, thread, buttons. $2 should cover materials for 3 shirts. He pulled out a leather wallet, extracted 2 silver dollars, and set them on her work table. Next to her single coin, they looked like salvation. "That's just for materials," Elena said quickly. The actual work will be, we can discuss that when you're done with the first batch. See if the quality matches what I need." There it was, the escape hatch he was giving himself, a way to walk away if this was really about charity and his conscience got satisfied. But Elena would have those $2 either way, enough for rent and a little food, enough to survive another week. "When would you need them?" she asked. "No rush, 2 weeks?" 2 weeks. Plenty of time. Almost insultingly plenty of time. Like he expected her to fail. Or like he was trying to help without making it obvious. Elena hated that she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Hunger and desperation had made her stupid, made her question everything. 2 weeks is fine, she said. Caleb nodded. He started to put his hat back on, then paused. "You know where my ranch is? North of town, I think? 5 miles up the north road, can't miss it. There's a sign. Falling apart, but readable." He settled the hat on his head. "When they're done, bring them out. Save you the trouble of finding me in town." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The money was already spent in her head. Rent to Mrs. Chen, beans and flour from the general store, maybe some cheap meat if there was anything left over. Caleb moved toward the door, then stopped again. "Word of advice, Miss Voss. Martha Davenport's been running her mouth about everyone in town. Has been for years. Most people with sense know to ignore about half of what she says." Then he was gone, ducking back through the door and disappearing into the afternoon light. Elena stared at the 3 silver dollars on her table. The smart thing would be to take them immediately to Mrs. Chen, to secure the roof over her head before anything else could go wrong. But she stood there for a long moment, looking at the coins and trying to figure out what had just happened. Charity or business? Pity or opportunity? Did it matter? Her stomach answered with another cramp. No, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had $3 and could make 3 shirts and maybe, possibly, claw back some small piece of stability. She picked up the coins, all 3 of them now, and headed for the boarding house. Mrs. Chen accepted the rent money without comment, which Elena appreciated more than she would have expected. No questions, no knowing looks, just a receipt and a nod. Small mercies. The general store was next. Elena bought carefully: flour, beans, a small quantity of salt pork, coffee that was probably more sawdust than coffee bean, but would do. The fabric came last. She found serviceable cotton duck, the kind that would hold up to ranch work. Nothing fancy, but solid. The kind of thing that would last. By the time she returned to her workshop, the sun was setting. Elena lit the oil lamp, carefully, because oil costs money, and spread the fabric out on her cutting table. She had Caleb's measurements from when he'd briefly taken off his coat to show her the kind of shirt he wanted. She'd memorized them, trained by years of her father drilling into her that a seamstress who needed to write measurements down wasn't paying enough attention. The first cut was always the hardest. Once you cut fabric, it was committed. No going back. Elena positioned her shears, took a breath, and made the cut. The rhythm of work was familiar, almost meditative. Pin the pattern, cut the pieces, mark the seams. She worked until her eyes burned from the lamplight and her back ached from bending over the table. When she finally stopped, she had all the pieces cut for the first shirt, ready to sew. She ate a small supper, beans heated over the workshop's tiny stove, a piece of hardtack she'd been saving, and allowed herself a moment of something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't complete despair either. Somewhere in between. A sense of having stepped back from an edge she'd been teetering on. Tomorrow she'd start sewing. She'd make the best shirts she'd ever made. And maybe, if she was lucky, this would be the start of climbing back to something resembling stability. The oil lamp guttered. Elena extinguished it carefully, preserving what was left. In the dark, she could hear the sounds of Ashford Crossing settling in for the night. Piano music from the saloon, someone's dog barking, the wind pushing dust against the buildings. She thought about Caleb Rourke and his transparent lie about needing shirts, about the way he'd mentioned Martha Davenport's gossip, warning her but also acknowledging it, about the fact that he'd given her 2 weeks when any rancher actually needing shirts would have wanted them in 3 days. Charity or business? Elena decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was still here, still working, still refusing to break. In a place like Ashford Crossing, that was its own kind of victory. The next morning started with another knock on her door. This time it was Billy Patterson, the 12-year-old who ran errands for half the town when he wasn't supposed to be in school. "Miss Voss?" His voice cracked halfway through her name. "Mrs. Henderson wants to know if you could come by the house. Says she needs to talk to you about something." Elena's stomach sank. The Hendersons. The wedding dress they'd decided they didn't need. This was either going to be more humiliation or possibly another chance. She couldn't tell which. "Tell her I'll come by this afternoon," Elena said. Billy nodded and ran off. Elena watched him go, thinking about how the town's children still had energy, still ran everywhere like they weren't living in a place slowly dying. Kids had that mercy. They didn't notice the decay until it was too late. She spent the morning working on Caleb's shirt, setting sleeves with tiny, precise stitches. The work absorbed her completely, which was a blessing. When she was sewing, there was no room in her head for worry or hunger or the constant calculation of whether she'd survive another week. There was just thread and fabric and the satisfaction of watching something take shape under her hands. At noon, she walked to the Henderson house. It was one of the nicer buildings in Ashford Crossing, which wasn't saying much. 2 stories painted white with a porch that only sagged a little. Mr. Henderson owned the feed store, which made him one of the town's more stable citizens. Mrs. Henderson answered the door herself. She was a large woman who'd probably been handsome once and was now fighting a losing battle against middle age and disappointment. "Miss Voss, come in." The inside of the house smelled like bread and furniture polish. Elena followed Mrs. Henderson into a sitting room that had actual matching furniture and curtains that didn't have holes. "I'll get straight to it," Mrs. Henderson said, not inviting Elena to sit. "I may have been hasty about the wedding dress." "I see. My daughter Emily, she's having second thoughts about the simple dress, wants something more substantial, like we'd originally discussed." Translation: Emily had thrown a fit and Mrs. Henderson had caved. Elena kept her expression neutral. "I'd be happy to finish the work," Elena said, "though I should mention the original timeline won't be possible now. I'd need at least 3 weeks. Mrs. Henderson's face tightened. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. Then I'd need to start immediately, and I'd need half the payment up front." This was dangerous. Elena was gambling that Mrs. Henderson's desire to avoid her daughter's tantrums outweighed her desire to avoid paying a struggling seamstress. It could go either way. Mrs. Henderson looked at her for a long moment. Elena could see the calculation happening. How much easier would it be to just give in? How much would Emily make their lives hell if the dress wasn't right? "Fine," Mrs. Henderson said finally, "but it needs to be perfect." "It will be." Elena left with $5 in her pocket, half the agreed payment, and a deadline that was going to require her to work essentially nonstop for 3 weeks. But $5. $5 was enormous. That was food and rent and maybe even a little left over. As she walked back through town, she passed Martha Davenport standing outside the dry goods store. Martha watched her with sharp eyes, the kind of gaze that was already calculating rumors and gossip. Elena met her stare directly, just for a moment, then kept walking. Let her talk. Elena had work to do. The pattern became routine. Mornings working on Caleb's shirts, afternoons and evenings on Emily Henderson's wedding dress. Elena worked by lamplight until her eyes blurred, took breaks only when absolutely necessary, ate whatever required the least time to prepare. The wedding dress came together slowly. It was an elaborate thing, far more elaborate than Emily Henderson had any business wearing in a place like Ashford Crossing, but that wasn't Elena's problem. Satin panels, delicate lace, tiny pearl buttons marching up the back, the kind of dress that announced you had money even if you didn't. Caleb's shirts, by contrast, were straightforward. Good fabric, strong seams, nothing fancy. But Elena put the same care into them that she put into the wedding dress. Every stitch clean and tight, every seam reinforced. The kind of work that would last. 10 days in, she finished the first shirt. She held it up in the lamplight, checking for flaws. Found none. It was objectively excellent work, the kind of thing she could be proud of. The question was whether Caleb would notice, whether he'd even care, or if this whole thing really was just charity and he'd take the shirt and thank her, and that would be the end of it. Elena folded the shirt carefully, wrapped it in brown paper, and set it aside. 2 more to go, then she'd make the trip to his ranch. The next knock on her door came from an unexpected source. "Miss Voss?" Dutch Kaufman stood in her doorway, hat in his hands. The saloon owner was a barrel-chested man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that suggested he'd seen most of what humanity had to offer and wasn't impressed. "Mr. Kaufman, got a proposition for you. My girls need some new dresses. Not fancy, just serviceable. Something that won't fall apart after a month of wear." He named a price that was fair without being generous. "Think you could handle 5 dresses? 2 weeks?" Elena did quick mental calculations. The Henderson dress would be done in a week. 2 more shirts for Caleb, then 5 dresses. It was a lot of work, but "I can do it," she said. Dutch nodded. "Heard you do quality work. Figure it's worth trying." He pulled out some bills. "Half up front?" "That would be fine." After he left, Elena sat down at her table and looked at the money. Between the Henderson job and Dutch's advance, she had more cash on hand than she'd had in 3 months. Not wealth by any measure, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to stop the constant calculating of whether she'd eat today. Something was shifting. She could feel it. Whether it was Caleb Rourke saying something to people, or whether the town had just decided she'd suffered enough, she didn't know. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was still here. Still working. Still refusing to disappear. The wedding dress was delivered with 2 days to spare. Emily Henderson tried it on while Elena and Mrs. Henderson watched. It fit perfectly. Elena had made sure of that. The satin caught the light just right. The lace looked delicate without being fragile. The pearl buttons marched up the back in a perfect line. Emily preened in front of the mirror. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Mrs. Henderson handed Elena the remaining payment without meeting her eyes. Shame, maybe. Or just the desire to get the transaction over with. Either way, Elena took the money and left. Caleb's 3 shirts were wrapped and ready. Elena loaded them into a canvas bag and started the walk north out of town. 5 miles wasn't far, but she wasn't used to walking distances anymore. By the time the ranch came into view, her feet hurt, and she was sweating despite the cool spring air. The sign Caleb had mentioned really was falling apart. Letters barely visible, wood rotted at the base. But beyond it, the ranch itself looked functional. Not prosperous, but not falling apart either. Decent fencing, barn that appeared structurally sound, a house that was small but well maintained. Caleb emerged from the barn as she approached. He looked surprised to see her, which suggested he really hadn't been expecting the shirts anytime soon. "Miss Voss? Mr. Rourke, I have your shirts." She pulled them out of the bag, still wrapped in their brown paper. He unwrapped the first one, held it up, examined the seams and collar. His face gave nothing away. "This is good work," he said finally. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" Elena named her price, fair but not cheap. Caleb pulled out his wallet without arguing and paid her. Then he surprised her. "I could use help around here," he said. "Not sewing, ranch work, mending fences, helping with livestock, that kind of thing. Pays daily, includes meals, not permanent, just seasonal work through summer. If you're interested." Elena stared at him. This was either genuine or the most elaborate charity scheme she'd ever encountered. "Mr. Rourke, I don't know anything about ranch work. Neither did I when I started. You learn or you don't. Either way, the offer's there if you want it." It was insane. She was a seamstress, not a ranch hand. She'd never mended a fence in her life, knew nothing about cattle, probably couldn't lift half the things that needed lifting. But the offer was real work for real pay. And meals. When was the last time she'd eaten a full meal she hadn't had to cook herself? "Can I think about it?" Elena heard herself say. "Sure. Offer stands for another week or so. After that, I'll need to find someone else." Elena nodded, took her payment, and started the long walk back to town. Her mind was spinning. Ranch work, physical labor in the sun. She'd never done anything like it. It would be hard, probably brutal. She'd likely be terrible at it. But it was work, real legitimate work that wasn't charity pretending to be business. By the time she reached her workshop, she'd made her decision. She was going to try. Elena gave Mrs. Chen notice that she'd be living out at the Rourke Ranch for the summer. The landlady raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. Probably assumed Elena had worked out some kind of arrangement that wasn't Elena's business to explain and wasn't Mrs. Chen's business to ask about. Let people think what they wanted. Elena had been the subject of town gossip for months now. What was one more rumor? She packed her belongings, which didn't take long since she didn't have much, and arranged for Billy Patterson to haul her trunk out to the ranch for a quarter. The boy was thrilled with the job and the money. Caleb met her at the ranch entrance that first morning. "You actually came. You offered work. I need work." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "All right then, let's see what you can do." What Elena could do, it turned out, was not much. At least not at first. Mending fences required strength she didn't have. Mucking out stalls made her gag. Hauling water left her arms shaking. By the end of the first day, every muscle in her body screamed and she smelled like livestock and sweat and failure. Caleb didn't say much, just showed her what needed doing, corrected her when she did it wrong, and let her figure it out. There was no sympathy in it, but there wasn't cruelty either, just the flat expectation that she'd either learn or quit. Elena didn't quit. The second day was worse than the first. The third day worse than the second. By the end of the first week, Elena was ready to admit this had been a terrible mistake. She was covered in bruises, her hands were blistered, and she was pretty sure she'd pulled something in her back that wasn't supposed to be pulled. But she kept showing up, kept trying, kept refusing to quit. And slowly, painfully slowly, she started getting better. The blisters hardened into calluses. Her arms stopped shaking when she lifted things. She learned to swing a hammer without hitting her own thumb, to patch a fence post so it actually held, to move around cattle without spooking them. Caleb's ranch hand, an old man named Joe who'd been working the land since before Elena was born, gave her grudging respect. "Most people quit by day 3, he said one afternoon. "You're stubborn. That counts for something out here." Elena didn't know if it was a compliment or just an observation. Either way, she kept working. The evenings were the strange part. After the work was done and the animals were fed and everything that needed doing was finished, there was this odd period of quiet. Caleb cooked, simple food but substantial, and they ate at a rough table in the ranch house kitchen. Joe usually disappeared to his own quarters, leaving Elena and Caleb in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. "Why'd you really offer me this work?" Elena asked one night, after 3 weeks of not asking. Caleb looked at her over his coffee cup. "Needed help." "You could have hired anyone. Someone with experience." "Could have." He took a sip. "Didn't." Elena waited, but he didn't elaborate. Typical. The man spoke like words cost money, and he was on a budget. "The shirts," she tried. "Did you actually need them?" "Need is a relative term." "Mr. Rourke." "Caleb." "Caleb, I'm asking directly. Was that charity or business?" He set down his cup and looked at her properly. You were one bad week from disappearing. Seen it happen too many times in this town. People get to a certain point and they either disappear or they do something desperate. Figured you were worth more than that. It wasn't quite an answer to her question, but it was more honest than she'd expected. Why me specifically? Elena pressed. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not quite sadness, but close. Had a wife once. Sarah. She was stubborn like you, proud, refused to break even when she probably should have bent a little. He paused. She died in a bad winter 7 years ago. Pneumonia. By the time I got her to a doctor, it was too late. Elena felt something shift in the air between them. I'm sorry. Point is, she was the kind of person who'd have starved before asking for help. And she did, basically. Worked herself sick trying to prove she could handle the ranch. I watched her do it, and I didn't stop her because I thought pride was admirable. He looked at Elena directly. It's not. It's just another way of dying slowly. So you decided to save me from myself? Decided to offer you an option that wasn't charity or starvation. What you did with it was your choice. Elena didn't know what to say to that. The honesty of it was almost uncomfortable. Thank you, she said finally, for the option. Caleb nodded and went back to his coffee. They didn't talk about it again, but something had changed. The silence between them became easier. The work continued, hard and exhausting, but Elena started noticing things she hadn't before. Like how Caleb's fences were in worse shape than they should be. How the barn needed repairs that kept getting postponed. How there were gaps in the operation, places where an extra set of hands or a different perspective might actually help. One evening, after a particularly long day fixing a broken water trough, Elena said, Your north pasture fence, it's going to fail completely within a month. Caleb looked up from the ledger he'd been studying. I know. So why not fix it now before it fails, and you lose half your cattle? Because fixing it properly costs money I don't have. Can keep patching it for free. Elena thought about this. What if we didn't fix it the way it was? What if we redesigned it? Use the good posts from the south fence that don't need to be as strong, move them north, and replace the south fence with something cheaper? Caleb stared at her. That might work. It would work. I've been looking at your operation. You're trying to maintain everything at the same level, but some areas matter more than others. You could redistribute resources instead of spreading yourself thin everywhere. You've been here 6 weeks and you're redesigning my ranch? Elena bristled. I'm suggesting improvements. You can ignore them if you want. But Caleb didn't ignore them. He pulled out the ranch maps, such as they were, and they spent the next 2 hours going over fencing, pasture rotation, water management. Elena didn't know ranching, but she knew efficiency. She knew how to look at a system and find the weak points. She knew how to prioritize. Turned out those skills translated. Taught. Summer deepened. The work got harder, longer days, hotter sun, livestock that needed constant attention. But Elena had stopped being the weak link. She could work a full day without collapsing. Her hands were rough and strong. She could look at a fence post and know if it would hold or fail. More importantly, she'd started seeing the ranch not as just a place she worked, but as a system that could be improved. She reorganized the tool shed so things were actually findable. She created a rotation schedule for pasture use that gave the grass time to recover. She found a cheaper feed supplier in a neighboring town and calculated that the cost of transport was still less than what they were paying locally. Caleb implemented every suggestion she made, not because he was patronizing her, but because they worked. Joe noticed too. Boss is different since you got here, he said one afternoon while they were working on a new section of fence. More decisive, less stuck. Stuck? After Miss Sarah died, he sort of froze. Kept everything the same because changing anything felt like betraying her memory or something. But you don't care about how things were. You just look at what is and figure out what could be. Elena thought about that while she hammered in another fence post. She'd spent so long trying to survive that she'd forgotten there was a difference between maintaining and building, between holding on and moving forward. Maybe that's what she and Caleb were doing for each other. She was teaching him that change wasn't betrayal. He was teaching her that pride didn't have to mean isolation. Late August brought the first real test. A neighboring rancher, Thomas Garrett, came by with a business proposition. He was looking to expand his operation and wanted to buy half of Caleb's land. the southern section that bordered his property. The offer was substantial, enough money to fix everything that was broken on the ranch and have plenty left over. It was tempting. Elena could see it in Caleb's face when Garrett laid out the terms. After Garrett left, Elena and Caleb sat on the porch while the sun set. "You're thinking about it," Elena said. "Be stupid not to think about it. That's real money. It's also half your land. Half the land I can barely maintain. You can maintain it if you do it smarter. We've already improved efficiency by 15% in 3 months. Give me another year and I could double that." Caleb looked at her. "That's a big claim." "It's an accurate claim. Garrett's offering you a way to solve today's problems by creating tomorrow's limitations. You sell that land, you'll never get it back. And when you want to expand in 5 years, you'll be boxed in. If I make it 5 years, you will. We will." Elena hadn't meant to say we, but there it was. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You planning to stay past the summer?" Elena realized she hadn't actually thought about that. When would she go back to town? Back to her workshop and her solitary sewing? The idea felt strange now, like thinking about wearing shoes that no longer fit. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm saying if you stay, we could make this place into something. Really something. Not just survival, but actual success. But it would mean taking risks, investing when we maybe shouldn't, betting on things working out. Like not selling to Garrett? Like not selling to Garrett. And like expanding the herd next spring even if it stretches us thin. And like trusting that your efficiency improvements will actually pan out." Elena looked out at the ranch, the land she'd spent 3 months learning to work, the fences she'd mended, the systems she'd reorganized. "I think we should do it. I think we should bet on this place." Caleb smiled, a rare thing that transformed his whole face. "All right then, we bet on this place." He sent Garrett a polite rejection the next day. The town, naturally, had opinions. When Elena went into Ashford Crossing the following week to pick up supplies, Martha Davenport made sure to intercept her outside the general store. "Elena Voss, heard you're living out at the Rourke place now." "I work there, yes." "Of course, work." Martha's tone suggested she believed something entirely different. "Must be nice, not having to worry about making rent anymore." Elena looked at Martha directly. "I earn every cent I make, same as anyone else." "Oh, I'm sure you do, dear, in whatever capacity." Something in Elena snapped. Not dramatically. No shouting, no scene. Just a quiet, firm realization that she was done caring what Martha Davenport or anyone else in this town thought. "Martha," Elena said calmly, "I've spent months listening to your poison. You're bitter because your own business is failing and you need someone to kick while they're down to feel better about yourself. But here's the thing. I'm not down anymore. I'm doing fine. Better than fine. So you can keep talking if it makes you happy, but I'm done listening." Martha's face went red. "How dare you?" "I dare because I don't need anything from you or this town, which means your gossip has no power. Enjoy your day, Martha." Elena walked into the store, bought her supplies, and left. As she loaded everything into the ranch wagon, she felt lighter than she had in months. Let them talk. She had work to do. Fall came with its own challenges. Preparing for winter meant different work. Securing buildings, stocking feed, making sure everything that could break in the cold was reinforced. Elena threw herself into it with the same intensity she'd applied to summer work. But there were good moments, too. Evenings when she and Caleb would sit on the porch and talk about plans for the ranch. Mornings when the sunrise turned everything gold and Elena would stop her work just to look at it. Times when Joe would tell stories about the old days and Elena would realize she was part of something larger than just survival. One night in early October, Caleb said, "You never talk about your family, your past." Elena was mending a bridle, fingers working automatically. "Not much to tell. Father had a ranch in Colorado. Lost it to debt, died 6 months later. Mother was already gone. No siblings. That's the story." "That's the summary, not the story." Elena looked up. "You want the painful version?" "Only if you want to tell it." She was quiet for a moment, then set down the bridle. "My father was a good man, proud man, kind of like you, actually, all stoic silences and hidden feelings. He taught me to sew because he said I'd need a trade if the ranch didn't work out. Turned out he was right. Must have been hard, losing everything. The hardest part wasn't losing the physical things. It was watching him lose himself. He'd built that ranch from nothing, and when it got taken away, it was like his whole identity went with it. He just gave up, stopped fighting, stopped caring, and I watched him do it and couldn't stop him. She picked up the bridle again, needing something for her hands to do. That's why I wouldn't beg. Why I'd rather have starved than asked for help. Because I saw what giving up looked like, and I swore I'd never let myself get there. But you took my help, Caleb pointed out. You didn't offer help. You offered work. There's a difference. Caleb nodded slowly. There is. Sarah taught me that. She never wanted charity either, just a fair chance to prove herself. Did she? Every day, right up until the day she died. His voice was rough. Sometimes I wonder if I should have insisted she rest more. Take it easier. If I'd maybe made her accept help instead of respecting her pride, she'd have resented you for it, Elena said firmly. And she might have lived, but she wouldn't have been the woman you fell in love with. Some people need to fight. Taking that away from them is worse than letting them struggle. They sat in silence after that, but it was the comfortable kind. The kind that comes when two people understand each other without needing to explain. By November, the ranch was as ready for winter as it was going to get. The operation was running smoother than it had in years. The cattle were healthy, the buildings were solid, and Elena had somehow, without quite meaning to, become a permanent fixture of the place. She'd stopped calling it Caleb's ranch in her head, started thinking of it as their ranch, which was presumptuous and probably foolish, but there it was. Winter came hard that year, the kind of winter that tested everything. Bitter cold, heavy snows, winds that cut through every layer you wore. The work became about survival again, keeping the animals alive, keeping themselves alive, keeping the ranch functional through weeks when the temperature never got above freezing. There were hard days. Days when Elena wondered why she'd ever left her warm workshop to muck through frozen mud and break ice off water troughs. Days when her hands were so cold she couldn't feel her fingers and her face hurt from the wind. But there were good days too. Days when she and Caleb and Joe would get everything done and huddle around the stove in the kitchen with hot coffee and know they'd survived another impossible day. Days when the sun would break through the clouds and make the snow-covered land look like something out of a dream. Days when Elena would realize she was happy, not comfortable, not easy, but happy. It was a strange feeling after so many months of just trying to survive. Actually enjoying her life felt almost subversive. In early December, Caleb asked her to marry him. He did it badly, awkwardly, almost angrily, like he was mad at himself for wanting to ask. They were in the barn, feeding the horses, and he just blurted it out. This working arrangement, it should be a partnership, legal partnership, marriage, I mean. If you're interested. Elena dropped the bucket of feed she'd been holding. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. Is that a no? It's a criticism of your delivery. Try again. Caleb looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Then, reluctantly, a smile tugged at his mouth. Elena Voss, you're stubborn and opinionated, and you reorganize everything I own without asking. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and you're too proud for your own good. I respect the hell out of you, and I think we could build something real here. Together. As actual partners. Will you marry me? That's better, Elena said. Yes. They got married in town 3 weeks later. Small ceremony at the church with Joe and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. No fancy dress this time. Elena wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself. No big celebration, just a quiet meal at the boarding house afterward. Martha Davenport attended, couldn't resist the chance to see it for herself, and managed to look sour the entire time. Elena ignored her completely. As they rode back to the ranch, their ranch, in the cold December twilight, Caleb said, You know this doesn't change anything about the work. Still going to be hard. Still going to be risks. I know. Good. Just wanted to be clear. Elena smiled and leaned against his shoulder. Clear as crystal, Caleb. Clear as crystal. Behind them, Ashford Crossing faded into the distance. That dying town with its gossip and judgment and slow collapse. They'd both come from it, been shaped by it, nearly been destroyed by it. But they'd survived. And more than survived. They'd found each other, found purpose, found something worth building. The ranch waited ahead, solid and real in the winter landscape. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And that, Elena thought, was enough. The first year of marriage taught Elena that love and partnership were two entirely different animals, and you needed both to survive what the frontier threw at you. Love was the easy part, the quiet moments on the porch, the way Caleb's hand found hers during cold nights, the shared understanding that came from working side by side. Partnership was harder. Partnership meant arguing about money at 2 in the morning. It meant disagreeing about which cattle to sell and whether to invest in new breeding stock or fix the barn roof. It meant learning to fight fair when you both had opinions strong enough to bend iron. Their first real fight happened in February, 3 months after the wedding. The winter had been brutal but manageable, and they'd made it through with minimal losses. Now they were looking at spring planning, and Caleb wanted to play it safe. "We buy the same number of cattle we sold last fall," he said, spreading the ledgers across the kitchen table. "Replace what we lost to winter, maintain our current size, build up some reserve funds." Elena looked at the numbers, really looked at them. That's a slow death strategy. That's a survival strategy. Same thing in this market. Every other rancher around here is thinking the same way, playing it safe. Which means in 5 years, we'll all still be exactly where we are now, barely making it. Caleb's jaw tightened. "And your alternative? We expand. Buy more cattle than we sold. Better quality breeding stock, even if it costs more up front. We take advantage of the fact that everyone else is scared." "With what money, Elena? We don't have reserves for that kind of gamble. We have enough for a down payment. The rest we finance." "Go into debt? After what happened to your father?" Caleb's voice was sharp, and Elena felt it like a slap. "That's not fair. It's relevant. Debt killed your father's ranch. You said so yourself." Elena stood up, needing to move. "My father's debt came from desperation, from trying to save something already failing. This would be different. This would be strategic investment. Or it would be risking everything we've built on your theory that expansion is the answer." "It's not a theory. It's math. Look at the numbers, Caleb. Really look at them. We're profitable now, but just barely. One bad season and we're back to struggling. But if we expand our operation, improve our breeding stock, we can weather bad seasons because our margins are higher. And if we're wrong, if the market doesn't cooperate, if we have 2 bad seasons in a row, then we adjust. We adapt. But we can't adapt if we're too afraid to take the first step." They stared at each other across the table. This wasn't really about cattle or money, Elena realized. This was about something deeper. Caleb had watched his wife die because he'd been too focused on building the ranch. Then he'd spent 7 years in a kind of stasis, maintaining but never growing, afraid that any change would lead to loss. Elena's arrival had started breaking that pattern, but the fear was still there. "I'm not Sarah," Elena said quietly. Caleb flinched. "What? You're afraid that if you take risks, if you push too hard, something terrible will happen, like it did with Sarah. But I'm not her, Caleb, and you're not the same man you were 7 years ago. Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't use her to win an argument." "I'm not using her. I'm just pointing out that fear is making your decisions, and fear is a terrible business partner." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired. "You didn't watch someone you love work themselves to death. You didn't sit there helpless while they got weaker and weaker and refused to admit they needed to slow down. I did. So yeah, maybe I'm cautious. Maybe I'd rather survive than risk everything on your ambition." Elena felt something crack in her chest. "My ambition? This is about our ranch, Caleb, our future. I'm not being reckless. I'm trying to build something that lasts. By gambling everything? By being smart about growth. There's a difference." They didn't resolve it that night. Caleb went to bed angry, and Elena stayed up working the numbers over and over, trying to find a compromise that didn't feel like surrender. By morning, she had something. "What if we split the difference?" she said over breakfast. Caleb looked up from his coffee, wary. "We expand, but not as much as I wanted. We buy better breeding stock for half the herd. Test the theory on a smaller scale. If it works, we expand more next year. If it doesn't, we've only risked half our operation." Caleb considered this. Half is still a lot. Half is also not nothing. It's progress without being stupid. It's calculated risk. And if the half we invest in fails, then we still have the other half to fall back on. We're not betting everything, Caleb. We're betting smart. He studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, half the herd, better breeding stock, but we do this carefully. No cutting corners, no rushing." "Agreed. They shook hands across the table like business partners, which in many ways they were. Then Caleb smiled, that rare expression that still caught Elena off guard. "You're going to be trouble, aren't you?" "Probably. That what you signed up for?" "Apparently." Spring came late that year, and when it finally arrived, it brought change. Elena spent weeks researching breeding stock, talking to other ranchers, learning everything she could about cattle genetics and market trends. Caleb handled the actual purchasing and negotiations, but he consulted Elena on every decision. Joe watched their partnership with what looked like amusement. "Never seen the boss listen to someone so much," he said one afternoon while they were working on fence repairs. Miss Sarah, she had opinions, but he was stubborn about considering them. With you, he actually stops and thinks. "Maybe because I'm usually right?" Elena suggested. Joe snorted. "Maybe because you argue better, or maybe because he learned something from losing her. Either way, it's good to see." The new cattle arrived in early April, 20 head of prime breeding stock that cost more than Elena wanted to admit. They were beautiful animals, healthy and strong, and looking at them made Elena simultaneously proud and terrified. This was real now. The gamble wasn't theoretical anymore. "Buyer's remorse?" Caleb asked, standing next to her at the pasture fence. "Wondering if I pushed too hard, if this was smart or just arrogant." "Little late for that now." "Thanks. Very reassuring." He bumped her shoulder with his. "We'll make it work, one way or another." They did make it work, but not without struggle. The new cattle required different handling, different feed, more careful management. Elena threw herself into learning everything she could, often working late into the night reading breeding guides and veterinary manuals by lamplight. Caleb handled the integration of the new stock with their existing herd, making sure there weren't problems with territory or dominance. By June, they were starting to see results. The breeding program was promising. The cattle looked healthy and were gaining weight faster than the old stock ever had. The numbers in the ledgers started looking better. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest they'd made the right call. Then the drought hit. It started slowly. A few weeks without rain in late June. Normal enough for the season. But then July came with scorching temperatures and cloudless skies. The grass in the pastures started browning. The creek that ran through the ranch's north section dropped to a trickle, then dried up completely. "How bad?" Elena asked Caleb one morning in mid-July. They were standing at what used to be the creek bed, looking at cracked mud and dead grass. "Bad. We've got the main well still producing, but if this keeps up..." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "How long can the well support the herd?" "At current levels? Maybe another month? 2 if we're lucky." Elena did quick calculations in her head. "We need rain." Brilliant observation. I mean significant rain. Not just a passing shower. We need sustained rainfall to replenish the water table. And if we don't get it? Elena looked out at the herd, the expensive breeding stock they'd invested everything in, the older cattle they'd been counting on selling in the fall. Then we have to make hard choices. Those hard choices started coming faster than either of them wanted. By early August, they were hauling water from town twice a week, an expensive and exhausting process. The cattle were losing weight despite their best efforts. Other ranchers were starting to sell off their herds early, flooding the market and driving prices down. "Thomas Garrett's selling everything," Caleb reported after a trip to town, "getting out while he still can." "What kind of prices is he getting?" Caleb told her. Elena felt sick. Those prices wouldn't even cover their feed costs, let alone the investment they'd made in the breeding stock. "We can't sell at those numbers," she said. "We'd lose everything. And if we wait and the drought continues, we could lose even more." They were in the kitchen, both exhausted from another day of emergency water management. The heat was oppressive even with the windows open. Elena's dress was soaked with sweat, and her hair was plastered to her forehead. "There has to be another option," she said. "I'm listening." Elena paced the small kitchen, her mind racing. The problem isn't just water. It's that everyone's panicking and selling at the same time. Supply and demand. Too much supply. Prices crash. Basic economics doesn't help us. "But what if we don't sell? What if we hold on to the cattle through the drought?" Caleb stared at her. "That's insane. The longer we wait, the more weight they lose, the less they're worth. Unless we can keep them healthy, If we can maintain their condition while everyone else is selling, when the drought finally breaks, we'll have premium stock and prices will have recovered. Maybe even gone up because there will be less supply. That's a massive if, Elena. If we can keep them healthy, if the drought breaks in time, if prices recover, those are a lot of assumptions. I know, but look at the alternative. Sell now at a loss, maybe lose the ranch anyway, or bet that we can outlast this and come out ahead when it's over. By doing what? We're already hauling water constantly. The well is dropping. We're running out of options. Elena stopped pacing. An idea was forming, risky and expensive, but possible. The Henderson place. They abandoned it last year, remember? Moved back east after the railroad decision. So? They had a deep well, really deep. Drilled it during the drought of '76 and it never ran dry. The property's been sitting empty since they left. Caleb caught on immediately. You want to buy the Henderson property for the water rights, not buy. We don't have that kind of money. But maybe lease? Or buy just the water rights? We could run a pipeline from their well to our ranch, supplement our own water supply. That would cost... Caleb grabbed a piece of paper and started calculating. At least $500, maybe more. We don't have that. We could take out a loan. More debt. On top of the debt we already took for the breeding stock. Elena, we'd be leveraged so far that one mistake would bury us. And if we do nothing, the drought buries us anyway. They looked at each other across the table. Elena could see Caleb wrestling with it, the fear of debt, the memory of her father's failed ranch, the ghosts of past losses all arguing against taking the risk. But she could also see something else, the recognition that sometimes playing it safe was just another way of losing. This is crazy, Caleb said finally. Probably. If we're wrong. We won't be. You can't know that. No. But I can believe it, and I can work like hell to make it true. Elena reached across the table and took his hand. I know you're scared. I am too. But we didn't build this ranch by playing it safe. We built it by taking calculated risks. This is just another one. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he squeezed her hand and said, All right, we bet on the water, but if this goes wrong, you're the one explaining it to Joe. Elena laughed despite everything. Deal. The next week was a blur of activity. Caleb contacted the bank about a loan while Elena tracked down the Henderson property's current owner, a bank in Denver that had foreclosed on it. She negotiated water rights and pipeline installation, arguing every detail until her throat was raw. The bank didn't particularly care about the property, so she got a decent deal, but it still took money they didn't have. The loan came through, barely. The bank officer, a thin man with spectacles and a permanently skeptical expression, made it clear he thought they were making a mistake. Most ranchers are selling, not borrowing, he said. You're going against every sensible piece of advice. Noted, Elena said, and signed the papers. Installing the pipeline was brutal work. They hired a drilling crew, which ate up a chunk of the loan money. Then they had to run pipe across 3 miles of increasingly dead landscape. The heat was merciless. Elena worked alongside Caleb and Joe and the crew, digging trenches until her hands bled through her work gloves. Other ranchers drove by and stared. Some stopped to offer condolences, as if Elena and Caleb were already ruined and just didn't know it yet. Thomas Garrett made a point of telling Caleb he was crazy. You'll lose it all, Garrett predicted. That drought's not breaking anytime soon. You're throwing good money after bad. Maybe, Caleb said. We'll see. But Elena could see the doubt creeping in. Every day without rain made the gamble look more foolish. The pipeline construction was behind schedule. The well on the Henderson property was producing water, but not as much as they'd hoped. The cattle were still losing weight. One night in late August, Elena found Caleb sitting on the porch in the dark, staring out at nothing. Can't sleep? She asked. Thinking about your father. Elena's stomach dropped. Don't. I can't help it. You told me how his ranch failed because of debt, because he borrowed against a future that never came. And here we are doing the exact same thing. It's not the same. Isn't it? We're in debt up to our necks, betting everything on rain that might not come. If this doesn't work, Elena, we lose everything. The ranch, our savings, our reputation, everything. Elena sat down next to him. Her own doubts had been eating at her for days, but hearing them voiced by Caleb made them feel more real, more dangerous. What do you want me to say? She asked quietly. That I'm scared? I am. That I lie awake doing the math over and over? I do. That sometimes I wonder if I pushed us into this because of pride or ambition or stupidity? Yeah, I wonder that too. Caleb looked at her. Then why are we still doing it? Because the alternative is definitely losing. Selling now guarantees we fail. At least this way we have a chance. A chance isn't certainty. Nothing ever is. Your ranch was failing before I got here. Not dramatically, but slowly. You were playing it safe and still losing ground. Sometimes safe is just slow death with better PR. Caleb smiled despite himself. You've got an answer for everything. Not everything. I don't have an answer for when it's going to rain. I don't have an answer for whether we made the right call. I just know we made a call, and now we have to see it through. They sat in silence for a while. Then Caleb said, if this works, if we make it through, I'm never doubting your instincts again. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have failed together. That's worth something. Elena leaned against him, and they watched the stars come out over land that was dying for lack of water. Tomorrow they'd keep working, keep fighting, keep hoping the gamble paid off. Tonight they just sat together in the dark and tried not to think about everything they stood to lose. The pipeline was completed in early September. When water first started flowing from the Henderson well to their ranch, Elena felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite relief, but maybe the possibility of relief. They had water now. Not unlimited, but enough to keep the herd stable. The cattle responded within days. They stopped losing weight, started looking healthier. The expensive breeding stock especially seemed to recover, their coats improving, their energy returning. But the drought didn't break. September came and went with no rain. October arrived with the same cloudless skies and brutal heat. Other ranchers who'd held out started selling off their remaining stock at whatever prices they could get. The market was flooded. Beef prices were in the basement. We made a mistake, Caleb said one morning in mid-October. They were checking the cattle, and while the animals looked good, the reality of their financial situation was unavoidable. We should sell now while we still can. The prices are terrible, and they might get worse. At least if we sell now, we can pay off part of the debt. Maybe keep the ranch. Elena looked at their healthy cattle, the breeding stock that represented everything they'd bet on. Give me until November. If it hasn't rained by then, we'll sell. Elena, one more month, Caleb, please. He agreed, but Elena could see it was eating at him. The debt weighed on both of them, a constant pressure that made sleep difficult and tempers short. They snapped at each other more, had tense silences that lasted for days. The partnership that had felt so strong was fraying under the stress. Joe tried to mediate once, then wisely stayed out of it. You two need to figure your own problems out, he said. I'm just the hired hand. But the problems felt unfixable. Elena had pushed them into this position with her confidence and her theories, and if she was wrong, they'd lose everything. The weight of that responsibility sat on her shoulders like physical mass. She started waking up at 3 a.m, heart pounding, mind racing through disaster scenarios. What if the drought lasted another year? What if they lost the ranch? What if Caleb ended up hating her for pushing them into debt? Late October brought the first real test of their marriage. They were in the barn, arguing about whether to sell the breeding stock first or the older cattle, when Caleb said something he obviously regretted immediately. Maybe your father was right. Maybe some risks aren't worth taking. Elena felt like she'd been slapped. Take that back. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. You think I'm making the same mistakes he did. You think I'm going to destroy us the way he destroyed himself. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. You've been thinking it for weeks. I can see it in your face every time you look at me. Caleb's jaw was tight. You pushed us into this, Elena. Your big ideas about expansion and risk-taking. And now we're drowning in debt and you're still insisting we hold on. Maybe it's time to admit this didn't work. It hasn't not worked yet. We're still standing. The cattle are healthy. If it just rains... It's not raining. Look around you. It's October and nothing has changed. We need to cut our losses before there's nothing left to save. Elena felt tears burning her eyes and hated herself for it. So what? You want to give up? Sell everything and start over? I want to survive. That used to be enough for you too, remember? Back when you were hungry and desperate and willing to take work you didn't know how to do just to stay alive? Whatever happened to that, Elena? She got tired of just surviving. She wanted to build something. Well, maybe survival was enough. Caleb's voice was harsh. Maybe ambition is just another word for reckless. They stared at each other in the barn's dim light, and Elena felt something crack between them. All the tension and fear and resentment that had been building for months, and it was all coming out now in ways that couldn't be unsaid. "I'm going to the house," she said quietly. "We can discuss selling tomorrow when we're both calmer." But that night, lying in bed next to Caleb, but feeling miles away, Elena couldn't sleep. Her mind kept cycling through the same questions. Had she been reckless? Had she let pride and ambition push them into a position they couldn't escape from? Was she repeating her father's mistakes despite swearing she never would? The worst part was not knowing. The drought might break tomorrow or never. Their gamble might pay off or destroy them. There was no way to know until it was too late to change course. She got up quietly, careful not to wake Caleb, and went out to the porch. The night air was cool, finally, after months of heat, and the sky was full of stars. Elena sat on the steps and tried to remember why she'd been so confident about this plan. Tried to find that certainty again. She heard footsteps behind her. Caleb sat down next to her, not speaking. They sat like that for a long time. Then Caleb said, "I'm sorry about what I said about your father. You weren't entirely wrong. I was cruel, that's different." He paused. "I'm scared, Elena, really scared. Not just about losing the ranch, but about what this is doing to us. We're tearing each other apart. I know, I'm scared too. If we lose everything, can we survive it as a couple?" Elena thought about that. "I don't know. Maybe, if we want to. Do you want to?" She looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd given her a chance when she needed one, who'd believed in her ideas even when they scared him, who'd bet everything on her instincts. "Yeah, I want to." "Me too." Caleb reached for her hand. "So, maybe we figure out how to stop blaming each other and start dealing with whatever comes next. Together. Even if what comes next is losing the ranch. Even then," Elena squeezed his hand, "we're not going to lose the ranch. You can't know that." "No, but I can decide to believe it. And I can work like hell to make it true. That's all any of us can do, really." They went back to bed eventually, and while nothing was fixed, something had shifted. The fear was still there, the debt was still crushing, the drought was still killing the land. But they'd remembered they were partners, that they'd chosen each other deliberately and could keep choosing each other even when things got hard. It was something to hold on to. November came with cooler temperatures, but still no rain. Elena and Caleb made their decision. They'd hold the cattle until the end of the month. If there was no rain by then, they'd sell whatever they could and try to salvage what remained. It was a compromise that satisfied neither of them, but was the best they could do. The town watched their situation with the same morbid fascination people always had for disaster. Martha Davenport made sure everyone knew about the Rourke Ranch's debt situation. Other ranchers offered condolences mixed with "I told you so's." The bank officer started making more frequent visits, checking on his investment with barely concealed worry. Elena ignored all of it. She threw herself into ranch work with the same intensity she'd had when she first arrived, desperate and determined. If they were going down, she'd go down fighting. On November 15th, clouds appeared on the horizon. Elena saw them first, early in the morning while checking the cattle. Dark clouds, heavy and promising. She stared at them for a long moment, afraid to hope, afraid they'd dissipate like every other promising cloud formation in the past 6 months. But these didn't dissipate. They built through the morning, piling up in massive formations that blocked out the sun. The air changed, got heavier, charged with electricity. The cattle sensed it too, becoming restless, milling around. By noon, it was obvious a major storm was coming. Caleb found Elena standing in the middle of the yard, face tilted up toward the darkening sky. "This could be it," he said. "Don't jinx it." The first drops fell around 2 in the afternoon. Fat, heavy drops that kicked up dust where they landed. Then more drops. Then suddenly a downpour that was so intense Elena could barely see the barn from the house. They stood on the porch and watched it rain. Really rain. Not a brief shower, but sustained, drenching rainfall that soaked into the parched ground and kept coming. It rained through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. Elena woke up the next morning to find it still raining. She went to the window and just stood there, watching water stream off the roof, listening to the sound of it hitting the earth. Next to her, Caleb woke up and came to stand behind her. "We made it," he said quietly. "Maybe. We won't know for sure until we see how the market responds." But Elena felt it, the shift. They'd survived the worst. They'd held on when everyone else had given up. And if their gamble paid off the way she thought it would, they were about to prove that sometimes the riskiest thing you could do was exactly the right thing. The rain lasted 3 days. When it finally stopped, the landscape looked transformed. The creek was running again. The grass, though still brown, was showing hints of green. The cattle looked healthy and well-fed, especially compared to the herds other ranchers had desperately held onto through the drought. More importantly, the market shifted. With so many ranchers having sold their herds during the drought, supply was suddenly limited. Prices started climbing. Within a week, they'd doubled. Within 2 weeks, they were higher than they'd been before the drought started. Elena and Caleb stood in the pasture, looking at their cattle. Healthy, prime breeding stock that was now worth significantly more than they'd paid for it, and did the math. "We could sell half the herd and pay off all our debts," Caleb said. "The loan, everything. We'd be clear. Or we could sell a quarter and keep the rest for breeding. Build the operation we always talked about." "That's still risky." "Yeah, but it's smart risky. We've got the best breeding stock in the region now. Everyone who sold during the drought is going to need to rebuild their herds. We can be the ones who supply that stock." Caleb looked at her, and Elena saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not just trust, but genuine partnership. "You really don't quit, do you?" "Not when I'm winning." "Are we winning?" Elena gestured at the healthy cattle, the rain-soaked land, the ranch that had survived when so many others hadn't. "Yeah, Caleb, I think we're winning." They sold a third of the herd at the elevated prices. The money was enough to pay off all their debts, the breeding stock loan, the pipeline installation, everything. For the first time in a year, they were operating without the crushing weight of debt hanging over them. More than that, they'd established a reputation, the ranch that had held on, the ranchers who'd bet against the drought and won. Other ranchers started coming to them for advice, for breeding stock, for partnership opportunities. Thomas Garrett, who'd sold everything during the panic, came by one afternoon looking chagrined. "Heard you made out pretty well," he said. "We did okay," Caleb replied, not quite able to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "Should have held on like you said, lost my shirt selling at the bottom." Elena, who was working nearby, couldn't resist. "Sometimes playing it safe is the riskiest thing you can do." Garrett nodded slowly, absorbing that. "Your wife's got a head for business, Caleb. You're lucky." After he left, Caleb found Elena in the barn. "That was a little smug." "I earned the right to be smug. Can't argue with that." They stood there grinning at each other like fools, and Elena realized something important. They'd survived the drought, yes. They'd made a smart bet that paid off, absolutely. But more than that, they'd survived the stress of it without destroying each other. The fight had tested their marriage as much as it had tested their ranch, and they'd come through it still partners, still united. That was worth more than any amount of money. By December, they'd solidified their position. The ranch was profitable. Their breeding program was successful. They'd started expanding into supplying breeding stock to other ranchers, which created a whole new revenue stream. Elena launched a side venture, using her sewing skills to create custom saddle blankets and ranch equipment. It wasn't much at first, but it brought in extra money and gave her something to do during slower periods. More importantly, it proved that her original skills weren't wasted, just redirected. The town's attitude toward them shifted too. They were no longer the struggling seamstress and the isolated rancher. They were the Rourkes, the couple who'd taken a massive risk during the worst drought in decades and somehow made it work. People looked at them differently now, with respect certainly, but also with something like awe. Martha Davenport, predictably, refused to acknowledge their success. She'd apparently told everyone they were going to fail, and their victory made her look foolish. Elena ran into her at the general store in early December. "Elena," Martha said coldly. "Martha, I hear you've been quite successful with your little ranch venture." "We've done all right." Martha's smile was thin and sharp. "Luck. That's all it was. You got lucky with the rain." Elena could have argued, could have explained that it wasn't luck but careful planning and calculated risk and refusal to give up when things got hard. Instead, she just said, "Maybe, but I'll take lucky over bitter any day." She left Martha sputtering behind her and felt lighter than she had in months, Let Martha think whatever she wanted. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Elena and Caleb had built something real, something that worked, something that could last. On Christmas Eve, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets despite the cold. The ranch was quiet, the work done for the day. Inside, Joe was probably already asleep. Tomorrow they'd have a simple celebration, nothing fancy, just the three of them sharing a meal and acknowledging they'd made it through the hardest year any of them could remember. "Think we'll ever have another year like this one?" Caleb asked. "I hope not. Once was plenty. But we survived it." "We did." Elena leaned against him. "You know what the crazy thing is? I'm not sure I'd change any of it. Not the drought, not the debt, not the fear, because all of it led to this. To us being here, together, having actually built something that matters." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "You're definitely insane." "Probably, but you married me anyway. Best crazy decision I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the clear winter sky. The land around them was recovering, slowly but surely. The cattle were healthy. The ranch was profitable. Their partnership, both business and personal, had been tested and had held. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There would be more challenges ahead, more risks to take, more times when they'd have to bet everything on their instincts and hope they were right. But that was life on the frontier. You either adapted and fought and refused to break, or you disappeared into the long list of people who'd tried and failed. Elena and Caleb had chosen to fight, and they'd won. For now, that was enough. The winter of 1883 proved that success brought its own complications. Elena discovered this truth on a freezing January morning when 3 different ranchers showed up at their door before breakfast, all wanting to buy breeding stock, and 2 of them brought their lawyers. "We can't keep up with this," she told Caleb after they'd finally cleared everyone out. "Every rancher within 50 miles wants our cattle. We're going to have to get organized or we'll drown in our own success." Caleb poured himself more coffee, looking tired. "What did you have in mind?" "A proper breeding program, formal contracts, set prices instead of negotiating every single sale. Maybe hire someone to handle the paperwork. That costs money. We have money now. The question is whether we invest it in growing the business or whether we stay small and manageable." Caleb gave her a look. "You've never chosen small and manageable in your life." "True, but I'm asking your opinion anyway." He thought about it while finishing his coffee. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. Professional operation, no more kitchen table negotiations." That decision led to 3 months of transformation that left Elena simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted. They converted the old bunkhouse into an office, hired a clerk named Robert Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, who had neat handwriting and understood numbers, developed standardized contracts and pricing structures, created a catalog of their breeding stock with detailed pedigrees and characteristics. It was during this process that Elena realized she'd accidentally created something she'd never intended, a reputation. Word had spread beyond Ashford Crossing and the immediate area. Ranchers from 3 counties over were writing letters inquiring about their breeding program. A cattle buyer from Denver made a special trip just to see their operation. "You've become famous," Joe observed one afternoon while they were working on fence repairs. "The lady rancher who beat the drought." Elena laughed. "I'm not famous. I just got lucky with weather and stubborn about quitting." Same thing out here. Luck and stubbornness are about the only qualifications that matter. But the attention made Elena uncomfortable. She'd spent so long being invisible, being the person the town walked past, that being noticed felt wrong somehow, like wearing someone else's clothes. The discomfort intensified when a journalist from a Denver newspaper showed up in March. He was young, enthusiastic, and completely unprepared for what actual ranch work entailed. "Miss Rourke," he said, following Elena around while she worked, "our readers would love to hear about how a woman succeeded in such a male-dominated industry." "Mrs. Rourke," Elena corrected, checking a cow that looked like it might be developing mastitis. "And I didn't succeed in spite of being a woman. I just succeeded. Gender didn't have much to do with it. But surely you faced discrimination? Challenges that a man wouldn't have encountered?" Elena straightened up, wiping her hands on her work pants. "You want the truth? Being a woman was the least of my problems. Being poor was worse. Being new to ranching was worse. Being in debt during a drought was worse. My gender mostly just gave people like you something to write about." The journalist scribbled notes. But you must acknowledge that your story is unusual. A seamstress becoming a successful rancher. My story is that I needed work and someone gave me a chance. Then I worked hard and got lucky with timing. That's it. There's no grand lesson about women's capabilities. I'm just a person who refused to quit. Despite her protests, the article that eventually ran made her sound like some kind of frontier revolutionary. It quoted her accurately, but framed everything in terms of gender struggle that Elena hadn't felt and didn't particularly want to claim. She tossed the newspaper across the kitchen table when she read it. This makes me sound like I was fighting some noble battle. I was just trying not to starve. Caleb picked up the paper, read it, and smiled. It's good publicity for the ranch. It's embarrassing. It's both. The article brought more attention and more complications. Women started writing to Elena asking for advice. Some wanted to know how to start their own ranches. Others just wanted to know if it was really possible to build a different kind of life. Elena didn't know what to tell them. Her path had been born of desperation and circumstance, not planning. She'd stumbled into ranching because she'd been starving, and Caleb had offered work. The success had come from stubbornness and calculated risk-taking, not from some revolutionary vision. But she tried to answer the letters anyway, usually late at night when the ranch work was done. She told them the truth. It was hard work. It required capital she'd been lucky to access. It meant sacrificing comfort and certainty. Most importantly, it required a partner who treated you as an equal. She'd been fortunate in that regard. Many women wouldn't be. One letter came from a woman in Missouri whose husband had died, leaving her with a failing farm and 3 children. She wrote asking if Elena thought she should try to keep the farm or sell it and move to town. Elena stared at that letter for a long time before responding. Finally, she wrote, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that keeping something your husband built won't bring him back, and it won't make you happy if the work destroys you. Sometimes the bravest thing is letting go and starting fresh. But if you do decide to fight for it, fight smart. Don't let pride or sentiment make your decisions. Look at the numbers, consider your options, and choose the path that gives you and your children the best chance. Whatever you decide, make sure it's your choice, not what you think you should do. She didn't know if it was good advice, didn't know if the woman would take it or ignore it. But it was honest, which was all Elena knew how to be. Spring brought new challenges disguised as opportunities. A cattle consortium from Chicago reached out expressing interest in a long-term supply contract. The money they were offering was substantial, enough to triple the ranch's income. But the terms required them to dedicate most of their breeding program to supplying the consortium, which would mean less flexibility in their own operation. It's guaranteed money, Caleb said, reviewing the contract. We'd know exactly what we're making for the next 5 years. Elena read through the terms more carefully. We'd also be locked in, no room to adapt if market conditions change, no ability to pursue other opportunities. We'd essentially be working for them. Stable work for them versus risky independence for us. Where have I heard that before? Elena smiled despite the tension. Point taken, but this is different. When you offered me work, I kept control over my own life. This contract would give the consortium control over our operation. They debated it for weeks. The consortium was patient but persistent, sweetening the deal with better terms, higher prices, guaranteed minimums. On paper, it was an incredible opportunity. In reality, it felt like a trap. The decision crystallized one evening in April when they were going over the ranch's books. They were profitable now, genuinely profitable, not just surviving. They had options. They'd built something that worked without needing to sell their independence to a Chicago consortium. We turned them down, Elena said. Caleb looked up from the ledger. You're sure? We didn't survive a drought and nearly lose everything just to hand control over to people who've never set foot on this land. We keep building our own thing, our own way. Even if it means less money? Even then, some things matter more than money. Caleb smiled that rare smile that still made Elena's heart skip. You know you're talking yourself out of fortune. I'm talking us into freedom. There's a difference. They sent the consortium a polite rejection. The representative who'd been courting them was baffled. You understand what you're turning down? We do, Elena said. We're just not interested in being employees disguised as partners. After he left, Caleb said, We might regret this. Maybe, but at least we'll regret it on our own terms. That philosophy guided them through the rest of the year. They expanded the breeding program but stayed independent. They hired 2 more ranch hands as the operation grew, but kept the core decision-making between Elena and Caleb. They invested profits back into the ranch, better facilities, improved pastures, a new barn that didn't leak when it rained. They also started helping other ranchers who were struggling. Not with charity, Elena had learned that lesson well, but with practical support. They'd buy struggling ranches' cattle at fair prices, helping the owners avoid bankruptcy. They'd share breeding stock at reduced rates with neighbors who were rebuilding after the drought. They'd offer advice freely to anyone who asked. "You're building a network," Robert Chen observed one day while managing the increasingly complex web of contracts and relationships. "Other ranches succeed, they buy from us. They fail, we help them recover. Either way, we benefit." Elena hadn't thought of it in those terms, but Robert was right. They were creating a system where success was shared rather than hoarded. It was good business, but it was also just good sense. The frontier was harsh enough without neighbors actively trying to destroy each other. Not everyone appreciated this philosophy. Thomas Garrett, still bitter about his own losses during the drought, started spreading rumors that the Rourkes were trying to control the regional cattle market. Martha Davenport, never one to miss an opportunity for gossip, amplified the stories. Soon there were whispers that Elena and Caleb were building a monopoly, that they were taking advantage of struggling ranchers, that their success was built on other people's failures. The rumors came to a head in June when Elena went to town for supplies and found herself confronted by William Becker, a rancher whose operation had failed during the drought. "You people are vultures," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear, "buying up cattle from desperate men at bargain prices, then selling them for profit. You're no different than the banks." Elena felt every eye on the street turn toward her. This was the moment where she could either defend herself or let the accusation stand. She chose honesty. "Mr. Becker, I bought your cattle at the market rate when you needed to sell, not below market, at market. You needed money to pay your debts, and I provided it. If you want to call that vulture behavior, fine. But the alternative was you getting nothing and losing everything. I gave you an option. Whether you took it or not was your choice. You took advantage. I took a risk. I bought cattle during a drought when everyone said I was crazy. I paid fair prices when I could have waited and bought them for less at auction after you'd already lost your ranch. You want to paint me as a villain? Go ahead. But we both know the truth." Becker's face was red, but he didn't have a response. Elena finished loading her supplies and left, very aware that the entire town had witnessed the confrontation. By evening, the story would be in every household in Ashford Crossing, probably with embellishments. "Let them talk," Caleb said when she told him about it. "People always need someone to blame for their own failures. Better us than them having to look in a mirror." But the confrontation bothered Elena more than she wanted to admit. She'd spent years being invisible in this town, then months being pitied, then finally achieving respect. Now she was being painted as some kind of predatory businesswoman. The unfairness of it stung. What bothered her more was that she couldn't entirely dismiss the criticism. She had profited from other ranchers' desperation. Yes, she'd paid fair prices and taken risks, but she'd also benefited from their losses. Was there a moral difference between that and taking advantage? And if there was, where exactly was the line? She raised this question with Caleb one night. "Are we the bad guys?" "What?" "In the story people tell about the drought. Are we the villains who got rich while others suffered?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "We're the people who took risks others weren't willing to take. We're the people who saw an opportunity and seized it. Whether that makes us villains or heroes depends on who's telling the story." That's not a real answer. It's the only answer there is. You want absolution? I can't give it to you. You want certainty that we did the right thing? No one has that. We made choices. They worked out. Some people benefited, some didn't. That's business. That's life. Elena knew he was right, but it didn't make her feel better. She'd always thought of herself as fundamentally good, someone who worked hard and played fair and didn't hurt people. But maybe that was naive. Maybe you couldn't build something significant without someone else losing in the process. Maybe success always had casualties. The moral ambiguity followed her through the summer. She found herself second-guessing decisions, wondering if they were being too aggressive in their expansion, if they were pushing too hard. Caleb noticed the hesitation. "You're thinking too much," he said one evening while they reviewed contracts. "Someone needs to." No, I mean, you're paralyzing yourself with what ifs and maybes. We make the best decisions we can with the information we have. That's all anyone can do. And if those decisions hurt people, then we deal with it. But we don't stop making decisions just because someone might get hurt. That's not business, that's cowardice. His bluntness was simultaneously frustrating and clarifying. Elena realized she'd been trying to be liked by the town, by other ranchers, by everyone, when she should have been focused on doing what was right for their operation. Trying to please everyone was a guarantee of pleasing no one. She threw herself back into work with renewed focus. They expanded their breeding program despite criticism. They bought more struggling ranches' cattle at fair prices despite accusations of profiteering. They continued building their network despite rumors of monopolistic behavior. And the ranch thrived. By August, they were running the most successful operation in 3 counties. Their breeding stock was in high demand. Their reputation, despite the gossip, was solid among people who actually knew ranching. More importantly, they were proving something Elena had believed but never quite articulated: that you could be smart and aggressive in business while still being fair. That success didn't require destroying others. That the frontier's supposed choice between ruthlessness and failure was a false dichotomy. September brought an unexpected visitor. A woman arrived at the ranch driving her own wagon, which was unusual enough to make Elena curious. She was probably in her 40s, dressed practically, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. "Mrs. Rourke? I'm Catherine Miller. I wrote you a letter back in spring." Elena remembered. The widow from Missouri with the failing farm. "You decided to keep the farm." "I did. Used your advice about fighting smart, not fighting proud. Sold the parts I couldn't manage, kept the core acreage, hired good help. Been profitable for 3 months now." "That's wonderful, but why are you here?" Catherine smiled. "Because I want to learn your breeding program. I've got good land but mediocre stock. I can pay for consulting services, or we could work out a partnership arrangement. I'm flexible." This was new territory. Elena had sold cattle and given advice, but actual consulting? Partnership with someone she barely knew? The old her would have been cautious, would have run the numbers a dozen times before committing. The new her said, "Come inside, let's talk specifics." They spent 3 hours discussing Catherine's operation, her goals, her resources. Elena was impressed. This woman knew her business and wasn't afraid to acknowledge her limitations. By the end of the conversation, they'd worked out an arrangement. Elena would provide breeding stock and consulting in exchange for a percentage of Catherine's operation's profits over the next 3 years. After Catherine left, Caleb said, "You just went into business with someone you met today." "I went into business with someone who reminded me of myself 3 years ago. Desperate but competent, proud but practical. That's worth betting on. And if it doesn't work out, then we lose some cattle and some time. But if it does work out, we've expanded our network and helped someone build something real. The upside outweighs the risk." Caleb shook his head, smiling. "You never stop, do you?" "Would you want me to?" "Absolutely not." The Catherine Miller partnership became a template for others. Over the next year, Elena would establish similar arrangements with 4 more struggling ranchers, mostly women, all of them smart and determined but lacking resources. She wasn't running a charity. Every arrangement was structured to benefit the Rourke Ranch. But she was creating opportunities for people who reminded her of who she'd been. The network grew. The ranch's influence expanded beyond just breeding stock into consulting, partnership investments, and regional coordination. Elena found herself in the unlikely position of being sought out for business advice by ranchers twice her age with 3 times her experience. "It's because you think different," Joe said one evening. "You didn't grow up in ranching, so you don't have all the assumptions the rest of us have. You see possibilities we don't because we're too busy doing things the way they've always been done." Maybe that was true. Or maybe Elena was just stubborn and lucky in equal measure. Either way, it was working. Winter came early that year, catching everyone off guard. By November, they were dealing with snow and cold that wouldn't normally arrive until January. The cattle handled it well. The breeding program had selected for hardiness. But the early winter compressed their timeline for preparations. They worked constantly through November and into December, racing against worsening weather to secure everything that needed securing. Elena found herself thinking about that first winter she'd spent on the ranch, when every task had been foreign and difficult. Now she moved through the work efficiently, automatically, her body remembering what her mind didn't have to consciously direct. On Christmas Eve, they had their traditional quiet dinner with Joe. But this year they also had Robert Chen and his Aunt Mrs. Chen, who'd become more friend than former landlady, and Catherine Miller, who was passing through on business and was invited to stay. The house was crowded and warm and full of conversation. Elena looked around the table and felt something she hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, that was too simple, but a deep satisfaction with the life she'd built, the people she'd gathered, the work she did. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked quietly. "That I'm a long way from counting coins and wondering if I'd eat." "Regret any of it?" "The struggle? Sometimes. The outcome? Never." After dinner, they stood on the porch despite the cold. The snow had stopped falling, leaving everything blanketed in white. The ranch looked peaceful, productive, permanent. "You know what the scary thing is?" Elena said. "We've gotten comfortable. We have money, we have success, we have respect. All the things we fought for." "Why is that scary?" "Because comfortable is when you stop being careful. When you stop seeing opportunities and start protecting what you have. I don't want to become the people we were competing against 3 years ago, so focused on maintaining that we forget how to grow." Caleb pulled her closer. "Then we won't. We keep pushing, keep risking, keep building. That's who we are. Even when it would be easier to just maintain what we have? Especially then." They went back inside where it was warm, where their odd collection of friends and employees were telling stories and laughing. The ranch spread out around them in the darkness, solid and real and full of possibility. 3 years ago, Elena had been 1 coin short of homelessness. Now she was standing in a home she'd helped build, surrounded by people she'd helped succeed, looking at a future she'd fought to create. It wasn't perfect. There were still people in town who resented their success. There were still nights when Elena woke up calculating risks and wondering if they'd pushed too far. There were still moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But there was also this: warmth and community, and the satisfaction of work that mattered. The knowledge that she'd taken every disadvantage, poverty, gender, inexperience, and refused to let them define her limits. The partnership with someone who saw her as an equal and a complement. Most importantly, there was the future. Not guaranteed, never that, but full of possibility. They'd proven that smart risk-taking worked, that refusing to quit mattered, that sometimes the person everyone counted out was exactly the person who'd win. Elena Rourke, who'd once been so desperate she'd considered eating paste, now stood at the center of a ranching network that spanned 3 counties. She'd built it through intelligence, stubbornness, and the willingness to bet everything when the odds were right. And she wasn't done yet. The winter deepened, harsh and unforgiving, but the ranch weathered it easily. They had resources now, preparations, experience. What would have been a crisis 3 years ago was merely an inconvenience now. In January, Elena received a letter from the Cattle Consortium in Chicago, the same one whose contract they'd rejected. They wanted to try again with better terms, more flexibility, a genuine partnership rather than a subordinate arrangement. Elena read the letter twice, then showed it to Caleb. They're persistent. They recognize value when they see it. Question is whether we recognize it too. They spent a week discussing it, running numbers, considering implications. The new terms were genuinely better. They'd maintain control of their operation while gaining access to Chicago markets and capital for further expansion. It was the kind of opportunity that could transform their ranch from regional success to something much larger. "What do you think?" Caleb asked after they'd exhausted the analysis. "I think 3 years ago we would have said no because we were afraid of losing control. Now we can say yes because we're confident we can maintain it. The question isn't whether the deal is good, it is. The question is whether we want to be that big. Do we?" Elena thought about the women she'd partnered with, the network they'd built, the reputation they'd established. Going bigger would mean more influence, more resources, more ability to create opportunities for others. It would also mean more complexity, more pressure, less flexibility. "Yes," she said finally, "but on our terms. We counter with even better conditions. We make sure we're genuine partners, not just suppliers with delusions of equality. And if they don't agree, we walk away and keep building what we have." They sent their counteroffer. To their surprise, the consortium accepted without significant negotiation. Apparently, their reputation had grown enough that Chicago was willing to treat them as equals. The partnership began in March, and within months it was clear they'd made the right decision. The Chicago connection opened markets they couldn't have accessed alone. Their breeding stock went from regional commodity to nationally recognized brand. The ranch's income tripled, then quadrupled. Success brought new pressures. They needed more staff, better organization, sophisticated record-keeping. The informal operation that had worked when they were small became inadequate as they scaled up. Elena found herself spending more time managing people and less time doing the work she loved. "This isn't what I signed up for," she told Caleb one night in April, frustrated after a day spent dealing with personnel issues and administrative problems. "What did you sign up for?" "Working with cattle, building something with my hands, not managing a bureaucracy." "Welcome to success. It's not always what you imagined." Elena knew he was right, but it rankled. She'd fought so hard to escape poverty and build something real, and now that she'd succeeded, the success itself was pulling her away from the work that made it meaningful. The solution came from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, who'd grown from clerk to operations manager, sat down with Elena and Caleb in May. "You're both trying to do everything," he said bluntly. "You need to delegate. You hired good people. Let them do their jobs. You focus on strategy and decision-making. They handle implementation." "We can't just hand over control," Elena started. "You're not handing over control, you're distributing responsibility. There's a difference. You stay in charge of big decisions. They handle day-to-day operations. Otherwise, you're going to burn out trying to manage every detail of an operation that's too big for two people to run alone." It was obvious once he said it, but Elena had been so focused on maintaining hands-on involvement that she'd missed the forest for the trees. They spent the next month restructuring their operation, hiring managers for different divisions, creating clear hierarchies and responsibilities, building systems that didn't require their constant oversight. It felt like giving up control at first, but gradually Elena realized Robert was right. She wasn't losing control. She was gaining leverage. Now, when she made a strategic decision, an entire team implemented it instead of just her and Caleb scrambling to do everything themselves. By summer, the ranch was operating more smoothly than ever. Elena had time to return to the work she actually enjoyed, working with cattle, developing breeding strategies, consulting with partners. Caleb could focus on expansion and market development. The operation scaled up without collapsing under its own weight. They'd learned another lesson, this one about leadership. You couldn't build something big by doing everything yourself. You built it by creating systems and trusting good people to execute them. The town's attitude toward them had evolved too. They were no longer just successful, they were pillars of the community, whether they wanted to be or not. Elena found herself asked to serve on town councils, to mediate disputes, to provide financial backing for community projects. She'd gone from invisible to unavoidable. Martha Davenport had finally stopped spreading rumors, possibly because no one believed them anymore, possibly because even her bitterness had limits. Thomas Garrett, meanwhile, had rebuilt his operation with their help and was now one of their partnership ranchers. He'd swallowed his pride and admitted that Elena had been right about the drought. It had taken him 3 years, but he'd gotten there. In August, Elena turned 28. Caleb surprised her with a small celebration, just the core ranch staff and their partnership ranchers, nothing fancy. But standing there surrounded by people she'd worked with and fought alongside, Elena felt the weight of what they'd built. "Speech," someone called out. Elena groaned. "I'm terrible at speeches." "Do it anyway," Caleb said, grinning. She stood up reluctantly. "Fine. 5 years ago, I was 1 coin short of homeless. I was hungry, desperate, and about 1 bad day from disappearing entirely. Then someone gave me a chance. Not charity, just an opportunity to prove myself. And I took it. I worked harder than I'd ever worked. I took risks that terrified me, and I refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier." She looked around at the faces watching her. "Some of you were there when I was struggling. Some of you came later. But all of you are part of what we've built here. This ranch, this network, this community, it exists because we chose to bet on each other. Because we decided that success didn't have to mean destroying others. Because we proved that you could be smart and fair at the same time." Elena paused, gathering her thoughts. "I don't know what the future holds. More challenges probably. More risks. More times when we'll have to decide whether to play it safe or bet everything on our instincts. But whatever comes, I know we'll face it the same way we've faced everything else. Together, stubbornly, and with the absolute refusal to let circumstance dictate our limits. She raised her glass. To taking chances, to refusing to quit, and to proving that sometimes the person everyone counts out is exactly the person who wins. They drank to that, and the celebration continued long into the evening. Later, when most people had left and Elena and Caleb were cleaning up, he said, "That was a good speech." I meant every word. I know, that's what made it good. They finished cleaning and stood on the porch, looking out at the ranch that had become their shared life's work. The buildings they'd built or improved, the pastures they'd cultivated, the cattle that represented years of careful breeding and strategic risk-taking, the network of partnerships that spread across 3 states. It was theirs, not in the sense of ownership, though legally it was, but in the sense of creation. They'd built it from nothing, or rather from less than nothing, from debt and drought and desperation. Think we've made it? Caleb asked. Elena considered. Made it where? To whatever we were aiming for when we started. I don't think we were aiming for anything specific. Just trying to survive, then trying to build something, then trying to make it last. Maybe that's enough. Not having a destination, just having direction. That's almost philosophical. Blame the success. It's making me reflective. Caleb laughed and pulled her close. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Obviously, I'm not letting you make decisions alone. You'd play everything too safe. And you'd risk everything on a hunch. Exactly. That's why we work. They went inside, where it was warm and comfortable and theirs. The ranch stretched out around them in the darkness, solid and real and full of tomorrow's possibilities. They'd built something that mattered, something that would last beyond them. But more than that, they'd proven something fundamental about the frontier and about themselves. That success wasn't about luck or circumstances or advantages. It was about refusing to quit when quitting made sense. It was about taking calculated risks when everyone said you were crazy. It was about partnership and stubbornness and the absolute conviction that you deserved better than survival. Elena Voss had arrived in Ashford Crossing with 1 coin and no prospects. Elena Rourke stood at the center of a ranching empire she'd helped build through intelligence, work, and the willingness to bet everything when the odds were right. The transformation hadn't been smooth or easy. It had been hard-won through drought and debt and doubt. But it had been worth it. Every single difficult step had been worth it. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by Billy Patterson, who was now 17 and too tall for his own coordination. He nearly tripped over the porch steps, handing it to Elena. "Urgent message from Chicago, Mrs. Rourke," he said, already backing away like the telegram itself might explode. Elena tipped him and opened it while he retreated. The words were brief and devastating. Market collapse imminent. Stop. Beef prices dropping 30%. Stop. Advise immediate action. Stop. She read it 3 times, each reading making her stomach sink further. They'd just committed to expanding their operation based on projections that assumed stable prices. They had contracts pending that would be worthless if prices dropped that much. Worse, they'd encouraged their partnership ranchers to expand too, based on the same assumptions. Caleb came out of the barn and saw her face. "What happened? Chicago says the market's about to crash. Beef prices dropping at least 30%, maybe more." "When?" "The telegram says imminent. Could be days, could be weeks." Caleb took the telegram, read it himself. His jaw tightened in the way it did when he was calculating bad scenarios. "If that's accurate, we're looking at serious losses. The expansion we planned would bankrupt us. And everyone we convinced to expand with us." Elena felt sick. "We pushed them to grow. We told them the market was strong. We were wrong." "We weren't wrong. The market was strong. Something changed." "It doesn't matter. We're still responsible for the advice we gave." They spent the rest of the morning in the office with Robert Chen, running numbers and scenarios. Every calculation looked worse than the last. If prices dropped 30%, they'd survive, but barely. If they dropped more, and market crashes tended to overshoot, they'd be in trouble. Their partnership ranchers, who had less cushion, would be devastated. "We need to warn them," Elena said. "Give them a chance to prepare." Robert looked up from his ledger. Warn them how? If we tell everyone to sell immediately, we flood the market ourselves and guarantee the crash. If we don't warn them, they get blindsided. There's no good option, Caleb said. Either we cause the problem or we let it happen. Pick your poison. Elena paced the office, mind racing. This was different from the drought. That had been a natural disaster, something no one could control. This was market forces, human decisions, the collective panic of thousands of buyers and sellers all trying to protect themselves. And somehow she had to find a way to navigate it without destroying everyone who'd trusted her judgment. "What if we don't sell?" she said slowly. Both men looked at her like she'd suggested jumping off a cliff. "Hear me out," Elena continued. "Everyone's going to panic and sell, right? That's what causes crashes, too much supply, not enough demand. But what if we do the opposite? What if we buy?" "Buy during a crash?" Robert's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone trying not to call their boss insane. "With what money?" "We've got credit from the Chicago partnership. Lines of credit we haven't touched. What if we use them to buy cattle when everyone else is selling? Prices will be at rock bottom. We'd be getting premium stock for pennies on the dollar." Caleb was staring at her. "That's the same strategy we used during the drought. Because it worked during the drought. Buy low, wait for recovery, sell high. Basic economics. The drought had a natural endpoint. Markets can stay crashed for years, or they can recover in months. Beef consumption isn't going away. People still need to eat. This is panic, not fundamental change. Panic creates opportunity." Robert cleared his throat. "If I may offer a perspective, this is either brilliant or catastrophic, and the difference depends entirely on factors we can't control. If you're right about recovery timing, you'll multiply your holdings. If you're wrong, you'll lose everything including the credit lines, which means bankruptcy." "So, same odds as the drought," Elena said. "Worse odds," Caleb corrected. "During the drought, we were betting on weather. This is betting on human psychology and market dynamics. Way more variables." Elena knew he was right. This was riskier, more complicated, less predictable. But the alternative was watching everything they'd built slowly erode, along with everyone who'd trusted them. At least this way they had a chance at not just surviving, but winning. "What about our partnership ranchers?" she asked. "We warn them what's coming, give them the option to sell now before prices crash completely. Take smaller losses instead of catastrophic ones. And if they ask what we're doing, we tell them the truth, we're buying. They can join us or protect themselves. Their choice." Caleb studied her face for a long moment. "You're really willing to bet everything again, after we just got stable?" "Stability is an illusion. We're either growing or dying. There's no maintaining in this business. You taught me that." "Pretty sure you taught me that." "Then we taught each other. Point is, we take the risk or we slowly lose what we've built. I'd rather go down swinging than watch us suffocate from caution." Robert diplomatically excused himself, leaving them alone in the office. Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the ranch they'd built together. Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "Sarah died because I let her take risks that killed her," he said quietly. "I swore I wouldn't make that mistake again. But here you are, proposing we bet everything, and I'm actually considering it." Elena went to stand beside him. "Sarah died from pneumonia, not from risk-taking, and I'm not her. I'm not you. We're different people making different choices in different circumstances." "Are we? Or are we just repeating the same patterns with different details? Does it matter? Every choice is a risk. Playing it safe is a risk. Doing nothing is a risk. At least this way we're choosing our risk instead of having it chosen for us." Caleb turned to face her. "If this goes wrong, then we'll have failed spectacularly while trying something audacious. I can live with that. Can you?" He smiled despite everything. "You're going to be the death of me. Or the making of you. Coin flip, really." They spent the next week executing their plan. Elena wrote out to each partnership rancher personally, explaining what was coming and giving them honest assessments of their options. Some chose to sell immediately, taking small losses to avoid catastrophic ones. Others, inspired by Elena's confidence or their own stubbornness, decided to hold and even buy more. Catherine Miller was one of the buyers. "You were right about the farm," she said. "You were right about the breeding program. I'm betting you're right about this too." "I could be wrong," Elena warned. "This is riskier than the drought. You could lose everything." "I was going to lose everything before you helped me, At least now I'm losing it while trying to win. That's progress. Thomas Garrett predictably sold everything immediately. You're crazy, he told Elena. Markets don't recover this fast. You're going to bankrupt yourself, and everyone's stupid enough to follow you. Maybe, Elena said. We'll see. The crash came exactly when Chicago predicted. Beef prices plummeted, dropping 40% in the first week. Ranchers across 3 states panicked and sold, flooding the market with cattle and driving prices even lower. By the end of September, prices had dropped 50% from their peak. Elena and Caleb bought methodically through the carnage. They used their credit lines, their cash reserves, every resource they could access. They bought premium breeding stock from desperate ranchers at fraction of what it had cost months earlier. They bought young cattle with excellent bloodlines. They bought entire herds from operations going bankrupt. Their partnership ranchers who'd chosen to buy did the same on smaller scales. Within 6 weeks, they'd collectively acquired thousands of head of cattle at prices that would have been impossible in a normal market. They'd also leveraged themselves to a degree that made the drought debt look conservative. If the market didn't recover, if prices stayed depressed for years like Caleb feared, they'd be destroyed. Not just broke, but ruined beyond recovery. The town watched with morbid fascination. Elena could feel the speculation every time she went into Ashford Crossing. Would the Rourkes survive this gamble? Were they geniuses or fools? The betting, she suspected, was fairly even. October brought the first signs that maybe they hadn't been completely crazy. Demand started firming up. Chicago and eastern markets, which had pulled back during the panic, began buying again. Not aggressively, but steadily. Prices stabilized, then inched upward. It's not recovery yet, Robert warned. Could just be a dead cat bounce before another drop. But November brought more improvement. Prices climbed 10%, then 15%. The cattle they'd bought at crash prices were now worth significantly more. Not profit yet. They still needed prices to climb another 20% just to break even, but movement in the right direction. December tested everyone's nerves. Prices plateaued, neither climbing nor falling. Every day felt like waiting for a verdict. The ranch's operations continued, but the underlying tension was constant. They'd bet everything on recovery. If it didn't come, they were finished. Elena found herself unable to sleep most nights. She'd lie in bed running calculations, working through scenarios, trying to find angles they'd missed. Caleb wasn't sleeping much either. They'd wake at 3 in the morning and just look at each other in the dark, both thinking the same thing. What if we were wrong? Christmas was subdued that year. They had the usual dinner with their core group, but the celebration felt forced. Everyone was thinking about the market, about the massive debt hanging over them, about what would happen if this didn't work. We'll know soon, Joe said, in what was probably meant to be comforting. One way or another. That was the problem, Elena thought. Soon they'd know if they were brilliant or bankrupt, and there was nothing they could do now but wait. The new year arrived with a blizzard that shut down most travel and business for a week. When the snow finally cleared in mid-January, the news from Chicago was shocking. Prices had jumped 20% in 1 week. Pent-up demand from the holiday season, combined with reduced supply from all the ranchers who'd sold during the panic, had created a shortage. Markets were scrambling to find cattle. Elena and Caleb stood in the office staring at the telegram that confirmed it. They were profitable. Not just break-even, but genuinely profitable. The cattle they'd bought at crash prices were now worth double or more. Their gamble had paid off. We did it, Caleb said, sounding almost surprised. We did it, Elena echoed, waiting for relief or joy or something. Instead, she just felt exhausted. Robert came in with updated calculations. If we sell now, we clear all debt and still have substantial profit. If we hold another few months, prices might climb even higher. Your call. Elena looked at Caleb. What do you think? I think we take the win. We've proven the point. Let's not get greedy. They sold strategically over the next 6 weeks, taking advantage of the price recovery without flooding the market themselves. By March, they'd cleared all debt, replenished their reserves, and still maintained a larger herd than they'd had before the crash. Their partnership ranchers who'd bought with them had similar results, some even better. The transformation in their financial position was staggering. They'd gone from leveraged and vulnerable to secure and expanded in less than 6 months. The ranch's value had effectively doubled. Their reputation had gone from successful to legendary. But success came with complications Elena hadn't anticipated. The Chicago consortium, impressed by their market timing, wanted more involvement in their operations. Other ranchers who'd sold during the panic were bitter about missing the recovery. And there were new people showing up at the ranch almost daily, wanting advice, wanting partnerships, wanting a piece of what the Rourkes had built. "I miss when we were just trying to survive," Elena told Caleb one evening in April. "Problems were simpler then." "No, they weren't. We just remember them that way because we survived them." Fair point. Still, this is getting overwhelming. We're spending more time managing perception than managing the ranch. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, something they didn't do often enough anymore. The ranch had grown to the point where there was always something demanding attention, always another decision to make, always someone needing their input. Caleb put his arm around her. "What if we step back?" "From what?" "From some of this. We've proven everything we needed to prove. We've built something that works. Maybe it's time to let other people run parts of it while we actually enjoy what we've created." Elena considered this. The idea of stepping back felt wrong, like admitting defeat or going soft. But maybe Caleb was right. Maybe success meant earning the right to not work yourself to death. Maybe there was a difference between building something and maintaining something, and they'd crossed from one to the other without noticing. "What would that look like?" she asked. "We keep strategic control, make the big decisions. But day-to-day operations? That's what we hired managers for. Let them manage. We supervise and guide, but we don't kill ourselves trying to control every detail." "You think it would work?" "I think we've built good enough systems that it has to work, and if it doesn't, we adjust. But running ourselves ragged just because we can isn't actually accomplishing anything except making us tired." Elena realized he was right. They'd been so focused on proving they could handle everything that they'd forgotten to ask whether they should handle everything. Success meant building something that didn't require their constant attention. If they couldn't step back, they hadn't actually built a sustainable operation, just a complicated house of cards held together by willpower. Over the next few months, they restructured again. They promoted Robert Chen to general manager with real authority. They hired division heads for breeding, sales, and partnerships. They created clear hierarchies and decision-making processes that didn't require Elena or Caleb to be involved in every choice. It was harder than Elena expected. Letting go meant trusting other people to make decisions she would have made differently. It meant accepting that good enough was actually good enough, even when she could see ways to make things better. It meant acknowledging that her obsessive involvement wasn't actually making things better anymore, just making her exhausted. But gradually, surprisingly, it worked. The ranch operated smoothly without her micromanaging. Problems got solved without her solving them. The business grew without her driving every aspect of growth. She found herself with something she hadn't had in years: time. Time to actually work with cattle instead of just managing cattle operations. Time to consult with partnership ranchers on breeding programs. Time to develop new strategies instead of just implementing existing ones. Time to sit on the porch with Caleb and watch sunsets. By summer, the ranch was more profitable than ever, despite, or maybe because of, their reduced involvement. The lesson was humbling. They'd built something good enough that it didn't need them desperately clinging to control. Their value was in vision and strategy, not in daily execution. Elena's reputation continued growing despite her attempts to stay out of the spotlight. Women wrote to her constantly now, asking for advice, inspiration, partnership opportunities. A publisher approached her about writing a book about frontier business practices. A women's college in the East wanted her to speak about success in male-dominated industries. She turned down most of it. The book felt presumptuous. She was 30 years old, hardly qualified to write definitive guidance. The speaking engagement felt exhausting. She wasn't interested in being a symbol or a spokesperson. She just wanted to run a ranch and live her life. But some opportunities were harder to refuse. A consortium of women ranchers from 4 different states asked Elena to help organize a regional association, a network for sharing information, coordinating market timing, and supporting each other. It was exactly the kind of practical cooperation Elena believed in, and she couldn't say no. The Western Women's Ranching Association held its first meeting in August at the Rourke Ranch. 15 women from across the region, each running their own operation, gathered to discuss shared challenges and opportunities. Elena had expected awkwardness or competition. Instead, she found solidarity and sharp intelligence. "We're all fighting the same assumptions," Catherine Miller said during one discussion. "That women can't understand cattle, can't make hard business decisions, can't compete with men. Individually, we prove people wrong. Together, we could change the entire industry. They established regular meetings, information sharing protocols, and collective market strategies. It wasn't formal or fancy, just practical cooperation between people who understood that collaboration beat isolation. Within 6 months, the association had 30 members. Within a year, it had genuine influence on regional markets. Elena found herself in the strange position of being a leader of something she'd never meant to lead. She'd just wanted to survive, then to build something stable, then to help others do the same. Somehow that had transformed into being the anchor of a network that was quietly reshaping how ranching worked in 3 states. "You've become what you were trying to avoid," Caleb observed one evening. "A symbol, a leader, someone people look to." "I hate it." "No, you don't. You hate the attention, but you love the work. There's a difference." Elena considered this. He was right, as usual. She did love the work, building networks, solving problems, creating opportunities. What she hated was the pedestal people kept trying to put her on, as if she was somehow special rather than just stubborn and lucky. Fall brought another crisis, this one personal rather than professional. Joe, who'd been with Caleb since before Elena arrived, had a stroke in October. It wasn't fatal, but it was serious enough that he couldn't work anymore. He was 73 and had spent 50 of those years doing hard physical labor. His body had finally said enough. Elena and Caleb visited him at the small house he'd built on ranch property. He looked diminished in bed, frustrated by weakness, angry at his body's betrayal. "This is humiliating," he said. "Can't even feed myself properly." "You're recovering," Elena said. "Give it time." "I don't have time to give. I'm used up, Elena, worn out." This is how it ends. This is how one chapter ends. The next chapter is you recovering and letting us take care of you for once instead of the other way around. Joe's eyes were wet. "I don't have anything saved. No family to take me in. I'm going to be a burden." Caleb leaned forward. "You've worked this ranch for 15 years, helped build everything we have. You think we're going to abandon you now? You've got a house here for as long as you need it, income from the ranch for as long as you live. Your family, Joe. Family doesn't get abandoned." Elena watched Joe try to hold back tears and fail. This tough old man who'd survived decades of frontier hardship, brought low by simple kindness. She reached out and took his hand. "You gave me a chance when I didn't know a fence post from a barn door. You taught me half of what I know about ranching. Let us return the favor." They arranged for care, hired a woman from town to help with daily needs, made sure Joe had everything required for recovery and comfort. It cost money, but they had money now. More importantly, it was the right thing to do. The frontier was brutal enough without treating people like disposable equipment. Joe's stroke made Elena think about longevity and legacy. They'd built something substantial, but what happened to it when they were gone? They had no children, something they'd discussed but never quite gotten around to addressing. The ranch would continue, presumably, but under whose vision? Whose values? She raised this with Caleb one night in November. "What happens to all this when we're gone?" Morbid question, practical question. We've spent years building something that works. Making sure it outlasts us seems like basic planning. Caleb was quiet for a while. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. Been too focused on surviving the present." "Well, we're surviving the present pretty well now. Time to think about the future." They spent the winter working on succession planning, creating structures that would preserve the ranch's values and practices even after they were gone. Establishing trusts to ensure Joe and others who'd helped build the operation were cared for. Setting up scholarships for young people, especially women, interested in ranching. It felt strange planning for their absence, like tempting fate. But it also felt responsible. They'd been given chances when they needed them. Passing those chances forward seemed like the minimum requirement for building something meaningful. By spring of 1886, the ranch was in its strongest position yet. Profitable, well-managed, influential beyond just their immediate operations. Elena was 32 and Caleb was 41. They'd built something remarkable from nothing, survived disasters that should have destroyed them, and created opportunities for dozens of others along the way. One April morning, Elena woke up and realized she was happy. Not content. Contentment was passive, was settling, but actively, consciously happy with her life and her choices and what she'd built. It was a strange feeling after so many years of just fighting to survive or succeed. She mentioned this to Caleb over breakfast. I think I'm actually happy. You say that like it's a disease. It feels dangerous, like acknowledging it might make it go away. Or maybe acknowledging it means you can actually enjoy it instead of always bracing for the next disaster. Elena thought about that. Caleb was right. She'd spent so long in survival mode that she'd forgotten how to appreciate success, how to live in the moment instead of always calculating the next risk. So what do we do now? She asked. What do you mean? We've survived poverty, drought, market crashes, everything the frontier could throw at us. We've built this ranch into something bigger than we imagined. We've helped others do the same. What's the next challenge? Caleb smiled. Maybe the challenge is learning to enjoy what we've built instead of always looking for the next mountain to climb. That sounds boring. That sounds healthy. There's a difference. But Elena knew herself too well. She wasn't built for static existence. She needed challenges, problems to solve, risks to take. The question was finding the right challenges, ones that mattered without requiring them to bet everything they'd built. The answer came from an unexpected direction. The railroad, which had bypassed Ashford Crossing years earlier, was reconsidering. Population had grown. The ranching operations had expanded. Suddenly, the town was worth a station after all. But the railroad company wanted local investment and guarantees before committing. They needed ranchers to pledge cargo, townspeople to invest in station construction, proof that Ashford Crossing was viable long-term. The town council approached Elena and Caleb as the obvious coordinators. Could they organize the ranchers, coordinate the investment, make the case to the railroad? It was exactly the kind of challenge Elena had been looking for. Not just building their own operation, but building infrastructure that would benefit everyone, not just surviving, but shaping the region's future. We'd be committing significant time and resources, Caleb warned. This isn't our ranch, it's community organizing, different skill set. But same principles, Elena countered. Identify what people need, create systems that work, convince people to cooperate instead of competing. We've been doing this at ranch scale. Why not regional scale? They spent the next 6 months as de facto community organizers. Elena coordinated the ranchers, building consensus around railroad commitments and convincing skeptics that cooperation beat isolation. Caleb worked with townspeople on investment structures and station planning. Together, they built a coalition that gave the railroad enough confidence to commit. The announcement came in October. Ashford Crossing would get its station. Construction would start the following spring. The town that had been dying when Elena arrived was now growing again, and she'd been central to making it happen. The celebration was enormous. The whole town turned out, and for once, even Martha Davenport looked pleased. Elena found herself surrounded by people thanking her, congratulating her, treating her like some kind of hero. She escaped to the porch of the general store where it was quieter. Caleb found her there a few minutes later. Hiding from your admirers? Trying to. Why do people think this was all me? It was everyone working together. Because you organized everyone. You convinced people to cooperate. Leadership matters, Elena. You can be uncomfortable with that, but it's still true. Elena looked out at the celebrating crowd. The town that had once watched her nearly starve was now celebrating success she'd helped create. The journey from desperate seamstress to community leader had taken 5 years and felt both inevitable and impossible. You know what the weirdest part is? She said. I spent so long just trying to survive that I never thought about what came after survival, about what you do when you've actually won. You find new challenges, or you enjoy the victory, or both. Which do you want to do? Caleb pulled her close. Both. I want to keep building things with you, but I also want to enjoy what we've built. I want to sit on our porch and watch sunsets. I want to travel and see places that aren't drought-stricken or market-crashed. I want to have a life, not just a successful operation. Elena leaned against him, watching the celebration. That sounds good. That sounds really good. They stayed there on the porch, while the town celebrated below. Two people who'd found each other when they were both struggling, who'd built something remarkable together, who'd survived everything the frontier had thrown at them. They'd proven that intelligence and stubbornness could beat circumstance, that strategic risk-taking worked, that you could build something real from nothing if you refused to quit. Most importantly, they'd proven that partnerships, real partnerships built on equality and respect, could accomplish what individuals couldn't. They'd made each other better, stronger, more capable. The ranch was theirs, but it was also proof that together they were greater than the sum of their parts. The sun set over Ashford Crossing, painting everything gold. Elena thought about that first sunset 5 years ago, when she'd been one coin short of homeless and too proud to beg. She'd come so far from that desperate woman counting her last pennies, but in some ways she was still that woman, still stubborn, still proud, still refusing to break no matter what the world threw at her. The difference was now she had something worth fighting for. Not just survival, but a life she'd built deliberately. Not just success, but meaningful success that helped others. Not just existence, but purpose. "Ready to go home?" Caleb asked. Elena smiled. Home. 5 years ago, she hadn't had one. Now she had a ranch, a partnership, a network, a community. She'd built all of it from nothing through work and will, and the absolute refusal to let circumstances dictate her limits. "Yeah," she said, "let's go home." They walked back to the ranch under emerging stars, two people who'd bet on each other and won. The future stretched ahead, uncertain as always, but full of possibility. Whatever came next, new challenges or earned rest or some combination of both, they'd face it together. That was enough. That was everything. The years that followed the railroad announcement should have been easy. That's what Elena kept telling herself during the sleepless nights of 1887, when complications kept multiplying like weeds in untended ground. Success, she was learning, didn't solve problems. It just traded them for different, more expensive ones. The railroad construction brought an influx of workers, which brought temporary prosperity, but also tensions. Longtime residents resented the newcomers. Businesses struggled to keep up with demand. Property values spiked, pricing out people who'd lived in Ashford Crossing for decades. The town council meetings devolved into shouting matches about growth and change and who deserved to benefit from the railroad they'd all fought to bring. Elena found herself mediating disputes she had no business mediating. A shopkeeper and a construction foreman got into a fistfight over prices. Two ranchers nearly shot each other over water rights complicated by new development. The boarding house owner, not Mrs. Chen, who'd retired, tried to triple rents overnight, sparking near riots. "This is what we wanted," Caleb said after a particularly brutal council meeting in March. "Growth and prosperity." "This is a mess," Elena corrected. "Growth without planning is just chaos with money attached." She was right, but being right didn't make the situation easier. The railroad that was supposed to save Ashford Crossing was threatening to tear it apart through growing pains nobody had anticipated. Elena spent weeks developing proposals for managed growth, zoning regulations, price controls, conflict resolution processes. The council adopted half of them, butchered the other half, and blamed Elena when things still went wrong. "You can't make everyone happy," Robert Chen reminded her after one particularly vicious council meeting where she'd been accused of favoritism, incompetence, and secret profiteering all in the same breath. "Some people just want someone to blame." Elena knew that intellectually. Emotionally, it was harder. She'd spent years building goodwill and reputation, and watching it get shredded by people who wanted simple answers to complicated problems was exhausting. The ranch itself was thriving, which somehow made everything else harder. They were profitable enough that money wasn't a concern, which meant Elena couldn't use financial pressure as an excuse to avoid community obligations. The breeding program was so successful, they had waiting lists for their cattle. The partnership network had expanded to 7 states. By every objective measure, they'd won. So why did Elena feel like she was losing? She finally admitted the truth to Caleb one night in April. They were in bed, both too tired to sleep, both thinking about the 100 problems that needed solving tomorrow. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," Elena said to the darkness. "With the ranch, I understand the rules. With business, I can see the patterns. But this community leadership thing? I'm making it up as I go and hoping I don't destroy everything by accident." "You're doing fine." "I'm not. Half the town loves me, half hates me, and I have no idea which half is right. Maybe both, maybe neither." Caleb rolled over to face her. "You want to quit?" "Yes. No, I don't know." Elena rubbed her eyes. "I want to go back to when the problems were simple, when success meant surviving another week, when I knew exactly what I was fighting for." "You're fighting for the same thing, just on a bigger scale." "It doesn't feel the same. It feels like I'm responsible for things I can't control, making decisions that affect people I'll never meet." trying to predict consequences I can't see. I'm tired, Caleb. Really tired. He pulled her close. Then we stepped back. We've got good managers. The ranch runs itself. The partnership network has other leaders. We don't have to be the solution to every problem. People always expect more than anyone can give. That's not your failure. That's just how people are. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to think she could step back without everything collapsing. But years of being the person who fixed things had trained her to see every problem as her responsibility. The idea of letting go felt like abandonment. The decision was made for her in May when Catherine Miller showed up at the ranch looking worried. Catherine's operation had grown substantially over the past few years, but growth had brought challenges she wasn't equipped to handle. I need advice, Catherine said without preamble. I've got a buyer from Kansas City offering to purchase my whole operation. Good price, clean deal. But taking it means giving up everything I've built. Elena and Catherine sat on the porch while Caleb tactfully disappeared. This was the kind of conversation that needed space and honesty. What do you want to do? Elena asked. That's the problem. I don't know. The money would set me up for life, but the ranch is my life. Selling it feels like selling myself. Elena understood that feeling intimately. Is this buyer someone who'd continue what you've built or gut it for parts? Continue it, probably. He's legitimate, but it wouldn't be mine anymore. I'd just be the woman who had a ranch once, a past tense. They sat in silence for a while. Elena thought about her own journey, from desperate seamstress to successful rancher to reluctant community leader. Each step had felt necessary at the time, but looking back, she couldn't say if the path had been inevitable or just the one she'd chosen without realizing there were alternatives. Can I tell you something honestly? Elena said. Something I haven't admitted to anyone, including myself? Please. Sometimes I wish I'd stayed small, kept the ranch at a manageable size, avoided the partnerships and the expansion and all this responsibility, just run a good operation and lived a quiet life. Catherine looked shocked. You're the most successful rancher in 4 states. You've built something incredible. I've built something big. I'm not sure that's the same as incredible, and I'm definitely not sure it's made me happier than I would have been staying small. So you think I should sell? I think you should decide what success actually means to you, not what it means to other people, not what it's supposed to mean, what it means to you, specifically, right now. Catherine absorbed that. And if I don't know, then you figure it out before you make irreversible decisions, because I've spent years chasing what I thought success looked like, and I've achieved it, and I'm still not sure if I made the right choices. Don't do what I did. Think first. After Catherine left, Elena sat on the porch alone for a long time. The conversation had forced her to confront truths she'd been avoiding. She'd achieved everything she'd set out to achieve and more. The ranch was successful, the partnerships were thriving, the community was growing. She'd proven every doubter wrong and exceeded every expectation. And she was miserable. Not all the time. There were still good moments, still satisfaction in work well done, still joy in partnership with Caleb. But underneath it all was a persistent dissatisfaction, a sense that somewhere along the way she'd taken a wrong turn without noticing. Caleb found her there as the sun was setting. He sat down without speaking, just present. After a while, Elena said, I think I need to make some changes. What kind of changes? Big ones, scary ones, the kind that might make people think I'm crazy or giving up or failing. Tell me. Elena took a breath. I want to sell most of our partnership stakes, keep a few key relationships, but get out of the network management business. I want to step back from community leadership, let other people fight about the railroad and growth and all of it. I want to shrink our operation back down to something we can actually manage ourselves without an army of employees. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. That's not what I expected you to say. Are you disappointed? Relieved, actually. I've been watching you kill yourself trying to be everything to everyone. Thought I'd have to convince you to slow down. Didn't expect you to figure it out yourself. I'm not sure I figured it out. I'm just sure I can't keep doing this. We've achieved success. Maybe it's time to figure out if we can achieve happiness. They spent the next 3 months methodically restructuring their lives. The partnership network was transitioned to a cooperative structure where decisions were shared among all members instead of funneled through Elena. Most of their expansion investments were sold to other ranchers at fair prices. Their staff was reduced back to core members who actually wanted to do ranch work rather than manage an empire. The response was predictable. Some people were supportive, others accused them of abandoning their responsibilities, of giving up, of betraying people who'd trusted them. The Chicago Consortium was particularly unhappy about losing their star partners. Several partnership ranchers felt abandoned, even though the cooperative structure gave them more control, not less. Elena discovered she cared less about the criticism than she'd expected. Maybe she was finally learning that you couldn't please everyone, and trying to do so was just a path to pleasing no one, including yourself. By fall, the transformation was largely complete. The ranch was back to something resembling its size and scope from 3 years earlier, profitable, manageable, focused on quality over quantity. Elena found herself doing actual ranch work again instead of endless management meetings. The days were long and physical, and deeply satisfying in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "You seem lighter," Joe observed one afternoon. His recovery had been slow but real. He couldn't do heavy work anymore, but he could still sit on the porch and offer commentary, which he considered his primary job now. Lighter how? Less like you're carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. More like you're just living your life. Elena thought about that while checking a cow that looked ready to calve soon. Joe was right. She did feel lighter. The constant pressure to grow, to expand, to prove herself over and over, it was gone. In its place was simple satisfaction in work that mattered without needing to matter to everyone. The railroad was completed in October, bringing the promised connection to larger markets and easier transport. The town celebrated with a dedication ceremony that Elena attended but didn't speak at. Others gave speeches about vision and progress and community achievement. Elena just watched and felt proud of something she'd helped build without needing credit for building it. Afterward, Martha Davenport approached her, a rare occurrence that immediately put Elena on guard. "I hear you've been selling off your interests," Martha said. "Giving up?" Elena could have gotten defensive, could have explained her reasoning, could have justified her choices. Instead, she just said, "Not giving up, refocusing. There's a difference. Some people are saying you couldn't handle the pressure, that you talked big but couldn't deliver. Some people say a lot of things. Most of it's nonsense. Anything else?" Martha seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. She'd clearly been hoping for drama. When none materialized, she drifted away, presumably to find someone else to needle. Caleb had watched the interaction from a distance. That was restrained. "I'm getting better at not caring what Martha thinks. Only took me 7 years. Progress." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence. The November air was cold but not brutal. The landscape looked peaceful, settled. Elena thought about how different everything was from that first desperate winter when she'd been learning to mend fences and questioning every decision that had led her to manual labor. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Caleb. "Offering me that job? All the chaos that came after?" "Every day," he said, completely deadpan. Elena laughed. "Liar. Fine. Never. Not once. You? Regret taking the job? No. Regret some of the choices we made after? Maybe. But overall, no regrets. Even with everything we're walking away from, we're not walking away. We're choosing differently. We proved we could build an empire. Now we're proving we're smart enough not to be trapped by it." Winter that year was mild, which everyone took as a good omen for the new year ahead. The ranch settled into rhythms that felt sustainable rather than frantically ambitious. Elena and Caleb found time for things they'd neglected: reading, conversation, actually enjoying meals instead of scarfing food between crises. Catherine Miller came by in December with news. She'd turned down the Kansas City buyer and recommitted to her operation. But she'd followed Elena's example, scaling back to something manageable rather than pushing for maximum growth. "Turns out, I don't actually want to be you," Catherine said, smiling to take the sting out of it. "No offense." "None taken. I don't want to be me either, at least not the me I was trying to be. That's the whole point." They talked for hours about the difference between success and satisfaction, between achievement and happiness, between building something impressive and building something you actually wanted to live with. It was a conversation Elena wished she'd had years earlier, but maybe she couldn't have heard it until she'd learned the lessons herself. As 1888 began, Elena found herself in an unfamiliar position: content. Not ecstatically happy every moment, not free of worry or challenge, but genuinely content with her life and choices. The ranch was stable, the marriage was strong, the work was satisfying, the future was uncertain, but not terrifying. She mentioned this to Caleb one morning in January. I think I might actually be content. Is that allowed? I'm not sure. Feels suspicious, like the universe is setting me up for disaster. Or maybe you've earned some peace. That's allowed too. Elena wanted to believe that, wanted to think that you could fight and struggle and build and win, and then actually enjoy the victory instead of immediately looking for the next battle. Maybe that was the real challenge, learning when to stop fighting. The challenge of contentment was tested in March when Elena discovered she was pregnant. At 33, after years of assuming children weren't in their future, the news was shocking. She sat in the doctor's office in town, trying to process what this meant for everything they'd just rebuilt. She told Caleb that evening after dinner. His reaction was complicated, joy mixed with fear mixed with the same overwhelmed uncertainty Elena was feeling. We never talked about this seriously, he said. I know. I thought it wasn't going to happen. We've been married 6 years. I figured if it was going to happen, it would have by now. Are you happy about it? Elena considered. Terrified. Also, yes. Also have no idea what this means for the ranch and our lives and everything we've built. We'll figure it out. We always do. But figuring it out proved harder than either expected. Pregnancy was physically demanding in ways that made ranch work difficult. Elena's energy levels crashed. Morning sickness was brutal and lasted well into the second trimester. The work she'd been enjoying became exhausting. More challenging was the mental adjustment. They'd built a life around two people who could work long hours and take risks and change plans quickly. A child would disrupt all of that, would require different priorities, different schedules, different everything. I'm not ready for this, Elena admitted to Caleb one night in April. I thought I was ready for anything, but this? I have no idea what I'm doing. Neither do I. We learn together? What if we're terrible at it? Then we'll be terrible at it together, and the kid will turn out weird but loved. Could be worse. Elena wanted his certainty but couldn't quite feel it herself. She'd spent so many years being competent, being the person who had answers, being someone people looked to. Pregnancy reduced her to feeling helpless and overwhelmed, reminded her she didn't actually control nearly as much as she'd convinced herself she did. The ranch work continued, but with adjustments. Elena did less physical labor and more planning and coordination. They hired additional help to cover what she couldn't do. The operation adapted, which was both reassuring and frustrating. Reassuring that it could function without her constant involvement. Frustrating that she'd apparently been less essential than she'd thought. Summer brought physical relief as the worst of the pregnancy symptoms faded, but psychological complexity intensified. Elena found herself thinking about her own mother, who died when Elena was young. What had her mother thought about raising a daughter in such harsh circumstances? What wisdom had Elena missed by losing her so early? She also thought about her father, whose failures had shaped so much of her drive to succeed. Would her child see her the same way someday? As a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong? Or would they understand the choices she'd made and why she'd made them? You're overthinking this, Caleb said when she shared these worries. Kids don't need perfect parents. They need present ones who care. How do you know? I don't. But it sounds right, doesn't it? It did sound right. Elena tried to hold on to that thought during the moments when fear threatened to overwhelm her. The baby arrived in early October, a girl they named Sarah after Caleb's first wife. Elena had suggested it months earlier, expecting resistance. Instead, Caleb had cried and said it would be an honor to carry Sarah's memory forward in this way. Labor was brutal. 30 hours that felt like 30 years. When it was finally over and the doctor placed the baby in Elena's arms, she felt a rush of emotions so complex she couldn't begin to parse them. Love, certainly. Fear, absolutely. Wonder at this tiny person who was somehow partially her creation. Terror at the responsibility she'd just taken on. She's perfect, Caleb said, voice rough with emotion. Sarah was not perfect. She was red and wrinkled and loud. But she was theirs, and that was something Elena hadn't quite grasped until that moment. The fierce protectiveness that came with having created another person. Whatever else happened, this child's well-being was now more important than anything Elena had previously considered important. The first few months were harder than anything Elena had experienced, including poverty and drought and market crashes. Sleepless nights, constant feeding, the anxiety of not knowing if you were doing anything right. The ranch faded to background concern. Business decisions waited. Everything narrowed to the basic cycle of caring for this tiny, demanding creature. "I used to think running a ranch was hard," Elena said to Caleb one morning after a particularly sleepless night. "I was an idiot. Running a ranch is easy. This is hard. But we're doing it. Are we? How do we even tell?" "She's alive and growing. That's probably success." Elena laughed despite her exhaustion. He was right. They were surviving this too, just like they'd survived everything else. Different challenges, same fundamental approach. Take it one day at a time and refuse to quit. By December, they'd found some rhythm. Sarah was sleeping more consistently. Elena had figured out how to work with a baby strapped to her. Not ideal, but functional. The ranch continued operating because they'd built good systems and hired good people. Joe loved the baby with a fierce devotion that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd rock her for hours, telling stories about the old days when the frontier was even rougher than it was now. Sarah would sleep in his arms while he talked, and Elena would watch and feel grateful that they'd created space for him in their lives. As the year ended and 1889 began, Elena took stock of her life with something approaching perspective. She was 34 years old. She'd gone from desperately poor to financially secure, from unknown to respected, from alone to surrounded by family, Caleb and Sarah and Joe, and their small circle of genuine friends. The ranch was no longer the empire they'd briefly built, but it was profitable and manageable. They'd proven they could build big, then proven they were wise enough to choose sustainability over size. That felt like genuine success rather than just impressive achievement. Most importantly, Elena had learned something crucial. Success wasn't a destination you arrived at and then lived happily ever after. Success was a series of choices you made every day about what mattered and what didn't, about what to fight for and what to let go, about building the life you actually wanted instead of the life you thought you were supposed to want. She'd spent years fighting to prove she deserved to exist in spaces that didn't want her, fighting to build something from nothing, fighting to survive disasters and thrive despite obstacles. All that fighting had been necessary, but at some point the fighting itself had become the point. She'd forgotten to ask what she was fighting for beyond just winning the fight. Having Sarah had forced that question. What kind of world was Elena building? What values was she modeling? What legacy was she creating beyond just financial success and professional reputation? These questions led to changes, some small, some significant. They donated land to the town for a school building, not for credit or recognition, just because a community needed infrastructure and they had resources to help. They established a fund for struggling ranchers who needed temporary support to avoid bankruptcy. Not loans, just grants, because sometimes people needed help without the burden of debt. Most controversially, Elena began mentoring young women interested in ranching or business, offering advice and sometimes financial backing for their ventures. This drew criticism from people who thought she was playing favorites or trying to manipulate the next generation. Elena learned to ignore these criticisms. She was building the kind of support network she wished had existed when she was struggling, and other people's opinions about her motivations didn't particularly matter. "You're doing it again," Caleb observed one evening in March. Sarah was asleep, and they were enjoying rare quiet time on the porch. "Building something bigger than yourself." "I'm trying not to. I'm trying to keep it small and sustainable. It's not the size that matters. It's that you can't stop helping people. You see someone struggling, and you have to fix it." Elena considered this. Is that bad? No. It's who you are. Just don't let it consume you again. Find the balance between helping others and taking care of yourself. "When did you become so wise?" "I've always been wise. You were just too stubborn to notice." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Elena thought about balance and sustainability and the difference between building something because you needed to prove yourself versus building something because it genuinely mattered. The line between those two things was subtle but crucial. By summer, Elena had found something resembling equilibrium. She worked the ranch part-time, focusing on aspects she genuinely enjoyed. She mentored a handful of women who showed real promise and dedication. She spent time with Sarah, who was growing into a personality rather than just a demanding set of needs. She maintained her marriage as an actual partnership rather than just a business arrangement that happened to include affection. It wasn't dramatic or impressive. Nobody was writing articles about Elena Rourke anymore. The ranch wasn't the talk of 3 states. They'd faded from prominent to simply successful, from newsworthy to normal. And Elena was fine with that. Better than fine. She was content in ways she'd never been during the height of their prominence. Turned out being remarkable was exhausting, and being simply good was its own kind of achievement. The Western Women's Ranching Association continued without her constant involvement, which proved it had been built on solid foundations rather than just Elena's personality. Catherine Miller had taken over much of the leadership, and under her guidance, the organization had grown more democratic and less dependent on any single person. This felt like success. Building something that didn't need you was harder than building something that did, but more sustainable. One afternoon in August, Elena took Sarah to visit the old workshop where she'd once struggled to survive. The building was still there, though it housed a different business now. Elena stood outside, holding her daughter, remembering the person she'd been 7 years earlier. That Elena, desperate, proud, one coin short of disappearing, felt like someone from another lifetime. But she was also the foundation of everything that came after. Without that struggle, without that refusal to break, none of this would exist. Your mother almost didn't make it, Elena told Sarah, who was too young to understand but old enough to listen. She was hungry and broke, and the world didn't care if she lived or died. But she chose to live, chose to fight, chose to take help when it was offered, even though her pride screamed that accepting help was the same as admitting defeat. Sarah grabbed Elena's hair and pulled, which seemed like appropriate commentary. Point taken, Elena said. I'm being dramatic. But it's true, little one. The life you have, the ranch, the family, the security, exists because your mother was too stubborn to quit and your father was kind enough to give her a chance. Remember that when you're older. Remember that your circumstances don't define your possibilities. You define your possibilities by refusing to let circumstances have the last word. Walking back to the ranch, Elena thought about legacy and meaning and what mattered in the end. She'd achieved financial success, built a respected operation, proven doubters wrong, helped others succeed. Those were real accomplishments. But what she was most proud of was simpler. She'd survived when survival seemed impossible. She'd built a life worth living when life had seemed determined to break her. That was the real victory, not the ranch's profitability or her reputation or the partnerships she'd created, just the basic fact of having refused to disappear when disappearing would have been easier. Fall brought the usual preparations for winter, but this year they felt different. Sarah was walking now, toddling around getting into everything. Joe was declining slowly but peacefully, surrounded by people who cared about him. The ranch was stable and profitable without requiring constant crisis management. Life had achieved a kind of sustainable rhythm that Elena had once thought was impossible. We did it, she told Caleb one October evening. They were watching Sarah play with building blocks, making towers and knocking them down with gleeful destruction. Did what? Survived. Built something. Created a life worth living. All the things we were trying to do without quite knowing what we were trying to do. You make it sound finished. Not finished, just reached a point where I can look back and say it was worth it. The struggle, the fear, the risk, all worth it for this. Caleb pulled her close. Even the parts where we nearly lost everything? Especially those parts. They taught us what mattered. You can't appreciate success without experiencing the alternative. As winter approached, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey more than usual. Maybe it was reaching a natural pause point in life. Maybe it was watching Sarah grow and wondering what world they were raising her in. Maybe it was just the perspective that came with time and distance from desperate circumstances. What struck her most was how wrong she'd been about almost everything at the beginning. She'd thought survival was the goal, when really survival was just the foundation for building something more. She'd thought success meant never being vulnerable again, when really success meant having enough security to take meaningful risks. She'd thought strength meant never needing help, when really strength meant accepting help and using it to build something greater than you could alone. Most surprisingly, she thought happiness would come from achieving specific milestones: financial security, professional respect, proven competence. But happiness, she'd discovered, came from much simpler things: work that felt meaningful, relationships built on genuine partnership, the satisfaction of helping others without destroying yourself in the process. The final lesson came in December when Martha Davenport died suddenly of a heart attack. Elena attended the funeral and felt genuine sadness, not for the person Martha had been, bitter and resentful to the end, but for the person she could have been if she'd learned to let go of resentment. She spent 30 years being angry at everyone who succeeded when she didn't, Elena told Caleb after the service. What a waste. What a terrible waste of a life. You could have become her if things had gone differently. Elena knew he was right. If she'd failed, if the drought had destroyed them, if any of their gambles hadn't paid off, she could have spent decades being bitter about it. The difference between Elena and Martha wasn't talent or intelligence or even luck. It was the willingness to take help when offered, to take risks when others played safe, to keep trying when failure seemed inevitable. And maybe most importantly, the wisdom to know when you'd won and could stop fighting. As 1890 began, Elena Rourke stood on the porch of her ranch house, watching her daughter play in the snow while her husband worked in the barn and Joe dozed in his chair. The ranch spread around her, solid and real and hers. Not the empire they'd briefly built, but something better. A life they'd chosen deliberately. She thought about that desperate woman counting coins 7 years earlier, wondering if she'd eat that week. That woman would have been amazed by this. Not just the material success, but the fullness of life, the richness of relationships, the simple satisfaction of having built something meaningful. Elena raised her coffee cup in a silent toast to that earlier version of herself. Thank you for not quitting. Thank you for being too proud to beg, but smart enough to accept help. Thank you for taking the first risk, which made all the others possible. The frontier had been brutal to her, testing her in ways she hadn't been prepared for. But she'd been brutal right back, refusing to break, refusing to disappear, refusing to let circumstance dictate her limits. She'd taken one coin and one chance and turned them into a life worth living. That was the real story. Not rags to riches, not a simple arc of struggle to triumph, just one stubborn woman who refused to quit, one patient man who gave her a chance, and a series of choices that somehow added up to meaning. Sarah called out, wanting to show her mother a snowman she'd started building. Elena set down her coffee and went to help, boots crunching in the snow. Behind her, the ranch stood solid against the winter sky. Ahead of her, her daughter laughed and played, secure in a world Elena had fought to create. 7 years from desperate to content, from invisible to respected, from alone to surrounded by family. The journey hadn't been smooth or easy or what she'd expected, but it had been hers, and she'd walked it with courage and stubbornness and eventually wisdom. In the end, that was enough. Not perfection, not complete victory, not a life without struggle or doubt. Just enough. Enough love, enough security, enough meaning, enough satisfaction. After spending years fighting for more, Elena had finally learned to appreciate enough. And in that appreciation, she found something she'd been chasing without knowing it. Peace. Not the absence of challenge or risk or uncertainty, but the deep peace that came from knowing she'd fought the fights that mattered, built something worth building, and created a life she could look back on without regret. The snow kept falling. Sarah kept laughing. Caleb emerged from the barn and waved. Joe woke up and called for coffee. The ranch continued its rhythms, unconcerned with drama or destiny, just existing steadily through another winter day. Elena stood in the middle of it all and smiled. This was success. Not the impressive kind that made headlines, but the real kind that made life worth living. And after everything she'd survived and overcome and built, real success was exactly what she'd earned. The future would bring new challenges, certainly. Life didn't stop testing you just because you'd won some battles. But Elena had learned she could face those challenges, not alone, but with partnership and community and the hard-won wisdom that came from refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. She'd started with one coin and no prospects. She'd built a ranch, a reputation, a family, a legacy. But more than any of that, she'd built herself, transformed from desperate seamstress to confident rancher, from isolated survivor to community pillar, from someone fighting for basic existence to someone choosing how to live meaningfully. That transformation was the real victory. Everything else, the ranch, the success, the respect, was just evidence of what happened when you refused to let the world's assessment become your reality. Elena Voss had arrived in Ashford Crossing, ready to disappear. Elena Rourke stood in the same town as someone who mattered, someone who'd built something real, someone whose story proved that circumstances might shape you, but they didn't have to define you. And that story, built from desperation and determination and one rancher's willingness to take a chance, was just beginning to show its full meaning in the life of a daughter who would grow up knowing that she came from strength, that her mother had fought for every good thing they had, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to quit. The snow continued falling on the ranch, covering everything in clean white. Inside the house, dinner would need preparing soon. Tomorrow would bring work and decisions and the ongoing task of living deliberately. But for now, in this moment, Elena just stood and appreciated what she'd built. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but honestly and with everything she had. That, in the end, was all anyone could do. Fight for what mattered, build what you could, love the people who deserved it, and refuse to let defeat have the final word. Elena had done all of that and more. And as she watched her daughter play in the snow of a ranch she'd helped build from nothing, she knew deeply, certainly, peacefully, that every hard choice, every risk taken, every moment of doubt overcome had been worth it. This was the life she'd fought for, and it was enough.